The first thing that feels strange is not what stands in the ruins, but what does not. Across the dry plains of Pakistan and northwestern India, across mounds of baked brick and wind-polished dust, an ancient world lies open beneath the sun, and yet its centre seems missing. There are streets, wells, drains, courtyards, workshops, waits, seals, granaries or storage buildings whose exact purpose scholars still debate. There are cities planned with a discipline that seems almost modern in its quiet confidence. There are houses with bathing floors, covered drains running beneath streets, platforms of fired brick, rooms arranged around inner courts, and neighbourhoods that suggest generations of people living by habits so orderly they became part of the landscape itself. But there is no obvious palace rising above the city, no giant statue of a conquering ruler, no royal tomb packed with gold, no carved wall showing a king crushing enemies beneath his feet, no long inscription naming the master of the land. The Indus Valley Civilization, one of the great civilizations of the ancient world, appears before history like a city without a throne. The mystery begins in silence, not absolute silence, because the ruins speak in other ways. Brick speaks, streets speak, drains speak, the careful standardization of weights speaks. The repeated symbols stamped onto seals speak, though not yet in a language anyone can securely read. But the kind of voice familiar from Egypt and Mesopotamia is absent. In Egypt, kings try to outlast death by turning themselves into stone and mountain. In Mesopotamia, rulers leave their names on tablets, temples, monuments, and boasts of conquest. In the Indus world, by contrast, power does not announce itself with a face. It does not seem to shout from walls. It does not sit in an obvious throne room waiting to be found. Whatever held this civilization together either left fewer traces than expected, or operated in a way that does not fit the usual pattern of early states. Under the sun at Mohenjo-daro, that absence becomes almost physical. The site rises from the plains of Sind like a low island of brick, its ancient name lost. The modern name, often translated as the Mound of the Dead, comes from a much later language and a much later imagination. The people who built the city did not call it that. Their own name for the place has vanished with their unread script. What remains is a city that once breathed with life more than 4,000 years ago. During the 3rd millennium BCE, when Egypt was building pyramids and Mesopotamian cities were competing for land, labour, and divine favour, here too, thousands of people lived together in a dense urban world. They rose before the heat became heavy. They drew water from wells. They moved through narrow lanes and broader streets. They worked stone, shell, copper, faience, clay, cotton, grain, and wood. They washed, cooked, traded, repaired, measured, sealed, stored, and carried. They lived within a system so consistent that the same proportions of brick appear across distant settlements, as if someone, somewhere, had decided that order itself mattered. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Yet the more closely the ruins are studied, the more careful the mystery becomes. It is not true that the Indus cities were simple or leaderless in an easy sense. Cities of this scale do not appear by accident. Streets require planning, drainage requires maintenance, standardized weights require agreement, trade over long distances requires trust, recognition, and control. Large settlements require systems for food, labour, space, storage, repair, and dispute. There must have been authority. There must have been decisions. There must have been people whose influence mattered more than others. But the evidence remains incomplete, and it does not reveal authority in the form archaeologists once expected. The Indus world may have had elites, administrators, ritual specialists, merchants, land-holding families, or councils of some kind. It may even have had rulers whose symbols have simply not been recognised. Scholars still debate how power functioned there. Because the civilization left behind order without an obvious author? This is why the Indus Valley is not merely a lost civilization. It is a challenge to a familiar story about civilization itself. For a long time, early urban life was often imagined as something that rose around kings, temples, armies, and command. A ruler gathers labour, a temple gathers grain, a palace organises power, an army defends and expands. The city becomes a monument to hierarchy. In many places, that model has real evidence behind it, but the Indus world complicates the picture. Its cities are monumental in scale but strangely restrained in expression. Their achievement lies less in giant statues and more in civic regularity, less in royal display and more in everyday infrastructure. The most impressive thing at Mohenjo-daro may not be a throne or a temple, but water moving cleanly through brick channels beneath a street. That detail matters. In many ancient cities, grandeur and misery sit side by side. Kings build temples while common people live among refuse, mud, disease, and crowding. Indus cities were not perfect, and no ancient city should be romanticized. There would have been smells, waste, insects, illness, heat, labour, inequality, and danger. But the visible priorities are unusual. Wells appear in remarkable numbers. Drainage systems run from houses into covered street drains. Bathing areas are carefully built. The so-called Great Bath at Mohenjo-daro, a large watertight brick tank set within a complex structure, still draws attention because it suggests ritual, public gathering, or elite ceremony linked to water, though its exact function remains uncertain. It is one of the most famous structures in the Indus world, but even it does not clearly point to a king. It points instead to a society in which water, purity, discipline, and shared practice may have carried deep meaning. The civilization that produced this world spread across an enormous region. Its settlements extended through the Indus River system and beyond, into areas of present-day Pakistan, northwest India, and surrounding zones, with contacts reaching toward Afghanistan, Iran, the Persian Gulf, and Mesopotamia, at its mature height, roughly between 2600 and 1900 BCE. It was among the largest Bronze Age civilizations on Earth by geographic extent. Yet its unity was not the unity of a single visible monarch marching across carved stone. It was the unity of repeated habits, brick ratios, seals, weights, pottery styles, ornaments, urban layouts, craft techniques, and shared symbols. That kind of unity is quieter, but perhaps more impressive, because it suggests a civilization bound not only by force, but by conventions strong enough to travel from city to city and endure for centuries. Still, restraint should not be mistaken for equality. Archaeology rarely gives simple moral answers. Some houses are larger than others, some goods are finer than others, some people had access to rare materials, skilled craft, and perhaps positions of influence. Cemeteries show differences, though not the spectacular royal burials found elsewhere. Workshops reveal specialised labour. Trade suggests organised production. The absence of obvious kings does not mean the absence of hierarchy. It means the hierarchy is harder to see. Power may have been distributed across families, neighbourhoods, merchants, ritual authorities, or administrators whose status did not depend on building pyramids or carving their victories into stone. What survives in the record suggests a society deeply organised, but not eager to explain itself in the language of kingship. The unread script sharpens the silence. Thousands of short inscriptions survive, usually on seals, ceilings, pottery, tablets, or small objects. They contain repeated signs, often arranged in brief sequences, sometimes beside animals such as the famous unicorn-like creature, bulls, elephants, rhinoceroses, tigers, and composite or symbolic forms. If these signs could be read securely, they might name people, offices, places, goods, gods, clans, or institutions. They might reveal whether the Indus world had rulers after all, but the inscriptions are short. Bilingual texts have not been found, and scholars disagree even about the exact nature and language behind the script. Many believe it represents a true writing system, while some have challenged that interpretation. No single explanation fully accounts for all the evidence. Until the script yields, the civilization remains partly locked from the inside. So the Indus mystery begins not with a sudden disappearance, but with an older and deeper uncertainty. Here is a civilization that builds great cities and refuses to give modern eyes the usual signs of command. It is not primitive. It is not chaotic. It is not a loose scatter of villages pretending to be urban. It is sophisticated, connected, durable, and technically skilled. Its people master brick, drainage, water management, craft production, and long-distance exchange. They occupy a landscape shaped by powerful rivers, shifting channels, monsoon rhythms, fertile soils, and dangerous floods. They create an urban culture that lasts for centuries, and then, slowly, the cities change, shrink, and lose their old coherence, leaving later generations to inherit fragments rather than a clear story. Standing in those ruins, the imagination searches for a ruler because other ancient civilizations have trained it to do so. It expects a name. It expects a dynasty. It expects a royal face staring from stone. Instead, the Indus offers a drain beneath the street, a seal pressed by an unknown hand, a brick made to a standard ratio, a well worn by repeated use, a script that remains unread, and a city plan whose maker is gone. The lost king may be the wrong thing to search for. Or perhaps the king is there, hidden behind symbols no one can yet understand. The evidence does not allow certainty, but it does allow a larger story, one that begins with rivers, mud, grain, and villages, long before Mohenjo-daro becomes a city of brick and silence. Long before the great brick cities rise, before seals pass from hand to hand and drains run beneath planned streets, the story begins with water moving through a vast and restless landscape. The Indus River and its tributaries descend from mountains, gather snowmelt and rain, and spread life across plains that can be generous in one season and dangerous in another. To the east, channels associated with the Gaga-Hakra system once shaped another important zone of settlement. Though scholars still debate how large and permanent and river-fed those channels were during different periods of the civilization's growth, what matters first is not a single river, but a world of shifting water-braided streams, floodplains, seasonal flows, marshy edges, fertile soils, and corridors that connect mountains, deserts, coasts, and interior plains. The Indus civilization is born in this moving geography, not on a fixed stage, and that makes its rise both powerful and fragile from the beginning. The earliest farmers of the wider region do not appear suddenly in full urban form. They emerge from older village worlds, shaped by experimentation over thousands of years. At places such as Mehrgarh, on the edge of the Bolan Pass in present-day Pakistan, evidence shows early farming and herding communities long before the mature Indus cities. People grow wheat and barley, herd cattle, sheep and goats, make pottery, use stone tools, shape ornaments, bury their dead with care. and slowly transformed the relationship between human life and the land. These communities are not yet Harappa or Mohenjo-daro, but they contain the deep roots of the later world. What survives in the record suggests a long process of adaptation rather than a sudden invention. Fields, animals, storage, craft, and exchange all become more dependable, and dependable life allows settlements to grow. This early world is not quiet or simple, it sits at a crossroads. Mountain passes bring materials and ideas from the Iranian plateau and beyond. River plains offer crops and grazing. Dry zones demand mobility, planning, and seasonal knowledge. People learn where water lingers after rain, where floods renew soil, where animals can be driven, where clay can be dug, where stone can be collected, and where communities can survive a bad year. The evidence remains incomplete. But archaeology shows that the Indus world does not grow in isolation. It absorbs, transforms, and localizes influences from surrounding regions while developing its own distinctive patterns. It is not merely copying Mesopotamia or Egypt. It is becoming something different. The environmental rhythm is central. The summer monsoon brings rain from the Indian Ocean, though not evenly and not reliably in every place. Snowmelt from the Himalayas and other mountain systems feeds rivers that can flood across the plains. Flooding is both gift and threat. It lays down fertile silt, but it can also destroy houses, shift channels, drown fields, and force rebuilding. Ancient people living here would have understood water not as scenery, but as a force that had to be watched, respected, and worked with. They would have known that a riverbank can move, that a channel can silt up, that a settlement placed too low may suffer, and that land made rich by flood can also vanish beneath flood. No single explanation fully accounts for the later rise of the Indus cities, but their relationship with water is one of the oldest clues. Across the plains, villages become more numerous and more connected. Some remain small, tied to farming, herding, and local exchange. Others occupy strategic places where routes meet or resources can be gathered. Over time, certain settlements grow into regional centres, pottery styles spread, craft specialisation increases, people produce beads, tools, ornaments, figurines, and containers with greater skill and consistency. The repeated use of certain forms suggests not only habit, but shared expectations. A pot is not just a pot, it belongs to a tradition. A bead is not merely decoration, it may carry identity, status, memory, or trade value. A standard way of making something allows strangers to recognise it. In a world without modern writing that can be read today, repeated objects become a kind of social language. One surprising feature of the Indus rise is how broad and gradual the foundation appears. In some ancient civilizations, the story is often told around a dramatic centre, a royal capital, a temple city, a conquering dynasty. In the Indus region, the early pattern looks more like a web. Many communities contribute to the civilization that will later become visible in its mature form. The great cities are not planted into emptiness. They grow out of a dense background of villages, roots, seasonal knowledge, and regional traditions. This may help explain why the mature civilization can spread so widely while still looking coherent. Its unity is built on a long preparation, on customs that have already travelled through families, traders, farmers, and craftspeople before city life reaches its height. The land itself encourages connection. The Indus River system offers natural corridors, while the coast opens toward maritime routes. To the west, highland zones provide access to stone, metals, and distant contacts. To the south, the Arabian Sea becomes a path rather than a boundary. To the east, settlement zones extend toward regions with their own local histories and environmental pressures. The civilization that eventually emerges is not simply a river civilization in the narrow sense. It is a river and root civilization, drawing strength from movement across ecological zones. Grain may move one way, shell another, copper another, timber another, beads another, and people with skills and stories move with them. Each movement leaves only fragments behind, but together they form the background of urban life. As villages grow, the need for coordination grows with them. More people mean more fields, more animals, more storage, more disputes, more waste, more risk from drought and flood, and more opportunities for exchange. Some form of leadership must have existed, though its shape remains uncertain. Elders, household heads, ritual specialists, skilled traders, or local chiefs may have played roles in different places. The later absence of obvious kings does not mean early communities had no authority. It means authority may have developed through practical obligations before it became political display. Someone has to decide where a wall is repaired, when grain is stored, how animals are managed, which route is safe, and how to maintain trust between groups. In small communities, such power can remain personal and familiar. In cities, it becomes something larger and more difficult to see. The climate, too, is not a fixed background. Over centuries, rainfall patterns shift, rivers alter their courses, local environments change through both natural processes and human pressure. The early Indus communities are successful, partly because they adapt to variety. They do not depend everywhere on one identical farming system. They use wheat and barley, later also other crops in different regions, and they rely heavily on cattle and other animals. They build in mud brick and eventually in baked brick where needed. They occupy floodplains, uplands, semi-arid zones, and coastal areas. This flexibility becomes a strength. It may also hide vulnerability, because a civilization spread across varied environments can survive local stress. but only as long as its shared systems continue to connect those places. By the time the first true cities begin to take shape, the ingredients have been gathering for generations. The people of the Indus world have learned how to farm, herd, store, build, craft, exchange, and organize across distance. They have inherited older village traditions and transformed them into something larger. They have learned to live with rivers that feed them and threaten them. They have learned the value of standard habits in a broad landscape. They have learned that order can be carried in bricks, measures, seals, and repeated forms. What is still missing is the fully urban expression of that order the moment when villages become cities, when streets begin to follow plans, when wells and drains multiply, when craft quarters intensify, and when a civilization without an obvious king begins to leave its most enduring signature in baked brick. The change from village life to urban order does not happen like a door opening all at once. It gathers in layers, in habits repeated so often that they become architecture, in paths worn into streets, in storage spaces expanded beyond household needs, in craft skills concentrated where raw materials and skilled hands can meet. Across the Indus world, settlements that once belonged to local landscapes begin to share a broader discipline. Mud brick gives way in key places to baked brick. More durable against water and time, houses become more complex, streets become more regular, drainage becomes more deliberate, craft production becomes more specialised. The growing towns do not merely become larger villages, they begin to behave like planned environments, shaped by decisions that reach beyond a single household or season. At sites such as Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Dholavira, Kalibangan, Rakhigarhi, Ganeriwala, and many smaller settlements, the mature Indus pattern becomes visible in different forms. No two cities are identical, and the evidence remains incomplete at many locations, but certain habits repeat with striking consistency. Bricks are often made according to a standard ratio, commonly described as 1:4 in thickness, width, and length. This may sound like a dry technical detail, but it is one of the most revealing clues in the entire civilization. A brick ratio is not a myth, not a royal boast, not a sacred image. It is a rule that must live inside workshops, moulds, labour routines, and expectations. It means builders across distant places understand the same logic of construction. It means walls, drains, platforms, and houses can be planned with shared assumptions. It means order has entered the hand. The streets show a similar instinct. In many mature Indus cities, major streets and smaller lanes form patterns that suggest planning, though not always the perfect grid once imagined by early excavators. There are variations, adjustments, rebuildings, and local responses to terrain. Still, the overall effect is one of control. Streets are not random gaps between houses. They are public spaces that organise movement, drainage, access, and neighbourhood boundaries. Houses often open onto smaller lanes rather than the larger streets, creating a more private domestic world behind external walls. This arrangement gives the city a restrained face. From the outside, a house may seem plain, almost closed. Inside, there may be rooms around a courtyard, bathing platforms, stairways, wells, storage areas, and spaces for work. The city does not reveal itself all at once. Its life turns inward. That inwardness is one of the subtler wonders of Indus urbanism. Unlike the spectacle of a palace facade or a temple tower, much of the civilization's sophistication lies at human scale. A person steps from a room onto a baked brick bathing floor. Water runs into a small drain. The drain connects to a larger covered drain along the lane. The lane meets a street. The street belongs to a neighbourhood. The neighbourhood belongs to a city whose builders have thought carefully about slope, flow, and repair. This kind of infrastructure requires more than clever design. It requires maintenance. Drains clog, bricks crack, floods damage walls, people dump waste where they should not. No ancient city escapes such problems, but the persistence of these systems across time suggests an urban culture that expects civic order to be part of daily life. The rise of these cities also changes labour. In a village, many households may produce much of what they need, even if specialists exist. In an urban setting, specialisation deepens. Some people work stone into beads with extraordinary patience. Some shape shell into bangles. Some work copper or bronze. Some make pottery in repeated forms. Some prepare faience, a glazed material that requires controlled knowledge of minerals and firing. Some carve seals from steatite and fire them until they harden and lighten. Some build, repair, carry, store, sort, measure, and trade. These activities leave traces in workshops, tools, unfinished objects, debris, furnaces, kilns, and waste heaps. What survives in the record suggests a world where skill is not occasional. Skill is organised. One lesser-known detail lies in the precision of Indus weights. Small stone weights, often cubical, appear in carefully graduated systems. Their consistency across distant sites points towards shared standards of measurement. This is not the kind of evidence that attracts crowds in a museum the way a golden mask does, but it may reveal more about how the civilization actually worked. Weights make exchange more trustworthy. They allow goods to be assessed, divided, stored, and transferred. They support craft production and trade. They may also reflect administration, taxation, or institutional control, though scholars still debate exactly how such systems operated. A world with standardized weights is a world in which people care about equivalence, value, and accountability. It is a world where strangers can do business because objects carry agreed meaning. Yet again, The question of authority remains difficult. Who enforces the brick standards? Who maintains the drains? Who controls the weights? Who lays out streets? It is tempting to imagine a central government issuing orders across the entire Indus region, but the evidence does not clearly reveal the machinery of such a state. It is equally tempting to imagine a loose network of independent cities sharing culture without political unity, but that too may understate the coordination involved. The truth may lie somewhere between familiar categories. Different cities may have had their own institutions while participating in a wider cultural system. Authority may have been strong in practice but modest in display. Power may have worked through control of craft, trade, ritual, water, land, or neighbourhood organisation rather than through royal monuments. The physical layout of some settlements hints at internal divisions. Many Indus cities include raised areas or mounded sectors that early archaeologists sometimes called citadels, contrasted with lower towns. These names can mislead, because they import assumptions from later fortified cities and royal centres. A raised mound might hold public buildings, storage facilities, ritual spaces, platforms, or elite residences, but its exact meaning varies and remains debated. At Mohenjo-daro, the elevated western mound includes the Great Bath and other substantial structures. At Dolavira, the city has a distinctive layout with fortified divisions and large reservoirs, adapted to an arid environment. At Harappa, mounds reflect long occupation, rebuilding, and complex organisation. The pattern suggests hierarchy of space, but not a simple palace and slum model. Urban order also changes the experience of time. Villagers live by the agricultural year, by rains, harvests, births, deaths, and seasonal movement. City dwellers still depend on these rhythms, but they also live by routines of market, craft, maintenance, storage, and administration. A beadmaker may spend days drilling a single hardstone bead. A potter may repeat shapes learned from earlier generations. A seal carver may engrave signs whose meanings are still locked away. A builder may follow brick proportions that connect him to cities he will never see. A woman drawing water from a neighbourhood well may use infrastructure planned long before her birth. Children grow up in lanes built by grandparents and rebuilt after floods. The city becomes memory made physical. There is nothing inevitable about this transformation. Many farming regions never become urban civilizations. Many towns grow and fail. Many local traditions remain local. The Indus rise depends on a rare convergence of productive landscapes, resilient crops and animals, craft knowledge, long-distance routes, social trust, shared standards, and the ability to organise labour without leaving behind the expected signs of kingship. No single explanation fully accounts for it. But by the mature phase, the result is unmistakable. Across a huge region, people live within a recognisable Indus world. They build with similar proportions, seal goods with similar symbols, measure with similar weights, and arrange urban life around an unusually strong concern for water, cleanliness, craft, and order. The old villages have not vanished entirely. They continue around and between the cities, feeding them, supplying them, and preserving local ways of life. But something new has appeared above them, a civilization whose greatness is not carved into the face of a king, but pressed into the plan of a street and baked into the shape of a brick. To understand how powerful that order became, it helps to enter one of its largest cities at its height, not as a map of ruins, but as a living place of heat, work, water, and silent signs. At its height, Mohenjo-daro is not a ruin beneath a white sky, not a mound of broken brick waiting for archaeologists, but a living city filled with heat, dust, water, animals, labour, and the small repeated movements of thousands of people. The Indus plain around it is broad and exposed, shaped by river channels and seasonal change. In the morning, before the full weight of the sun settles over the streets, the city begins to stir behind its plain outer walls. Doors open into lanes. Water is drawn from wells, cooking fires are prepared, craftspeople return to unfinished work, traders inspect goods, children move through courtyards and rooftops, cattle low somewhere near the edge of the settlement, the smell of damp brick, grain, smoke, animals, clay, and human life gathers in the warm air. Nothing about this city is silent while it lives. Its silence belongs to the future. The city is large by Bronze Age standards, though exact population estimates remain debated because ancient urban density is difficult to reconstruct. Some scholars have suggested tens of thousands of inhabitants, but the evidence remains incomplete, and any number must be treated with caution. What is clearer is that Mohenjo-daro is a major urban centre, built and rebuilt over generations, with different sectors, streets, wells, drains, platforms, and substantial structures. Its buildings are mostly made of brick, many of them fired hard enough to survive long after wood. Reed, cloth, and plaster have vanished. The city rises in layers because people do not abandon it after every flood or collapse. They repair, level, rebuild, and continue. Under the visible streets lie earlier streets. Under walls are older walls. Mohenjo-daro is not a single design frozen in time, but a long argument between planning, damage, memory, and renewal. The daily experience of the city is shaped by water more than by monuments. Wells are everywhere, or nearly so compared with many other ancient cities. Some serve individual houses or small clusters of households, while others are public or semi-public. Their brick rings descend into the ground like vertical shafts of continuity, repaired and reused over time, in a hot environment. This is not a luxury. Water is survival, cleanliness, craft, ritual, and social order. A household with access to water gains comfort and status, but also responsibility. Water must be drawn, carried, stored, poured, drained, and kept from turning the house into mud. The sophistication of Mohenjo-daro lies in the fact that these ordinary actions are built into the architecture. Inside many houses, rooms are arranged around open courtyards that bring light and air into otherwise enclosed spaces. Some houses have stairways, suggesting upper floors or access to flat roofs. Roofs may have been important living spaces during cooler hours, places for drying goods, sleeping in certain seasons, working, or watching the city from above. Bathing areas are made with carefully laid brick floors, sometimes sloped so water can run into drains. Latrine-like features in some houses suggest practical concern with waste, though interpretations vary. The evidence does not permit a perfect reconstruction of every domestic routine, but it shows that private houses were not crude shelters. They were engineered spaces, shaped by comfort, privacy, climate, and repeated use. From the lanes, much of this domestic world may have been hidden. Houses often present relatively blank walls to the street, with entrances placed to preserve privacy. The largest streets carry movement, but the deepest life of the city unfolds behind walls. This gives Mohenjo-daro a peculiar character. It is organised, but not theatrical. It does not seem designed to impress visitors with a royal avenue leading toward a palace. Its order is distributed. It appears in the repeated decisions of households and neighbourhoods. The city's grandeur is not a single object, but a system. The drains are among the clearest signs of that system. Many run along streets, covered with removable brick or stone slabs. Smaller drains from houses feed into larger channels. Some include soakage jars or pits, devices that may have helped collect sediment before wastewater entered the public drain. This is a surprising level of attention to maintenance. Drains are not oppressive if they cannot be cleaned. The builders understood that infrastructure has to be accessible, not merely built. Scholars still debate how regularly the drains were maintained and by whom, but their design suggests a society that expected urban life to be managed through practical cooperation. Someone had to clear blockages, someone had to replace covers, someone had to notice when water stopped moving. On the raised western mound stands the structure known today as the Great Bath, perhaps the most iconic surviving feature of Mohenjo-daro. It is a large rectangular tank built of finely fitted baked bricks, waterproofed with bitumen in places, and approached by steps. Around it are rooms and corridors whose functions remain uncertain. The tank is not large enough to be a reservoir for the whole city, and its careful construction suggests something beyond ordinary washing. Many scholars interpret it as a place for ritual bathing or ceremonial activity, though the details remain debated. No inscription explains it. No statue of a god stands beside it with a label. No royal dedication survives. The Great Bath feels important, but its importance is strangely impersonal. It suggests gathering, purification, authority, or sacred discipline without revealing the face of the power behind it. Elsewhere in the city, craft production turns raw materials into objects that travel far beyond the neighbourhood where they are made. Beadmaking is especially remarkable. Carnelian, agate, steatite, faience, shell, and other materials are worked into ornaments with skill that demands time and specialised knowledge. Long carnelian beads, carefully drilled and polished, are among the most admired Indus products. Their production is not casual. Hard stone must be selected, shaped, heated or treated in some cases, drilled with precision, polished, and distributed. A single bead can embody hours or days of labour. To the person who wears it, it may signal beauty, status, connection, or identity. To archaeologists, it signals networks of skill and exchange. Small objects carry some of the city's greatest mysteries. Seals carved from steatite often show animals and short sequences of signs. The so-called unicorn motif appears frequently, though the animal is not a real unicorn in the later mythical sense. It is a one-horned creature, perhaps a stylized bull or a symbolic being, often shown before a ritual stand or object whose meaning remains uncertain. Other seals show humped bulls, elephants, rhinoceroses, water buffalo, tigers, goats, and composite forms. These are not random decorations. Their repetition suggests identity, ownership, trade, office, ritual affiliation, or some other system of meaning. But because the script remains unread, the seals remain like locked doors with beautiful handles. The people of Mohenjo-daro live among these signs. A merchant or administrator presses a seal into clay, a craftsperson recognises a motif, a household stores goods in jars, a trader measures commodities with standardised weights, a child sees symbols that modern scholars cannot read. In the city's own time, these signs are not mysterious. They are part of practical life. They belong to transactions, authority, memory, or belief. The mystery belongs to later observers who can hold the seal but cannot hear the language around it. Mohenjo-daro also has its ordinary discomforts. The city is not a perfect ancient utopia. Heat would be intense. Flooding could damage entire neighbourhoods. Waste management, however advanced for its time, would never be effortless. Disease, crowding, insects, food shortages, injury, and social tension would have been part of life. Some houses were larger and better equipped than others, suggesting inequality. Some people had access to rare goods, while others likely lived more modestly. The absence of royal tombs does not mean everyone shared equally. What survives in the record suggests a disciplined city, not a classless one. And yet, compared with many ancient urban centres, Mohenjo-daro's priorities remain unusual. Its visible investment in wells, bathing, drains, street planning, and standardised construction gives it a civic character that still feels distinctive. It does not announce itself through conquest scenes. It does not preserve the names of kings. It offers no easy story of a divine ruler commanding the masses. Instead, it presents an urban life built around repeated acts of order. Every brick, drain, seal, bead, and well becomes part of a larger pattern. To walk through Mohenjo-daro at its height is to enter a city where power is everywhere and nowhere, present in the infrastructure, hidden in the signs, and dispersed through the routines that keep the city alive. But Mohenjo-daro is only one face of the Indus world. Its silence should not be mistaken for isolation. Far to the north, east, south, and west, other settlements share its habits while adapting them to their own landscapes. Harappa, older in discovery and central to the civilization's modern name, reveals that this world is not built around a single city alone. It is a network. And the mystery of the missing king becomes even sharper when the same quiet order appears across distances too large to be explained by accident. Harappa gives the civilization one of its modern names, but it does not give up its secrets easily. It lies far to the north of Mohenjo-daro, in the Punjab, where the landscape has been shaped by the Ravi River and by centuries of farming, brick robbing, railway construction, excavation, erosion, and modern settlement. When early investigators began to understand what lay there, the site had already suffered. Ancient bricks had been removed in large quantities and reused. Especially during colonial-era railway building, that loss is one of the quiet tragedies of archaeology. A city can survive for 4,000 years beneath earth, only to be dismantled before anyone fully understands what it is. Even so, what remains at Harappa is enough to show that Mohenjo-daro was not a lone miracle. It was part of a much wider world. The ruins of Harappa reveal long occupation, complex mounds, craft activity, burials, platforms, walls, streets, drains, and evidence of changing settlement through time. The city develops through earlier phases before the mature Indus period, making it especially important for understanding how local village and town traditions became part of a larger urban civilization. Here, as at Mohenjo-daro, the evidence remains incomplete, but the pattern is unmistakable. This is not a minor outpost copying a distant capital. Harappa is a major centre in its own right, deeply rooted in its region and connected to a broader Indus cultural system. Its people build, measure, craft, seal, trade, bury, and organise in ways that echo other cities while still preserving local details. The distance between Harappa and Mohenjo-daro matters. These cities are separated by hundreds of kilometres, yet they share enough features to suggest more than casual contact. Standardised weights appear, similar seals appear, brick proportions repeat, pottery styles and craft traditions overlap, certain symbols and animal motifs return again and again. This is the hidden network of the Indus world, not a network visible through royal roads named by kings, but through objects that behave as if people across vast distances understand the same rules. A trader carrying goods from one settlement to another can rely on familiar measures. A seal impression may be recognised by someone far from the place where it was carved. A brickmaker may use proportions known across generations and regions. Culture here travels not through slogans, but through standards. Such standardisation is one of the strongest signs of integration in the Indus civilization. It suggests shared expectations across a region larger than many ancient states, yet it does not automatically prove a single empire. Scholars still debate whether the Indus world was politically unified, organised as a collection of city-states, governed through regional authorities, or held together by looser cultural and economic ties. No single explanation fully accounts for the combination of wide uniformity and local variation. If there was a central authority, it left no obvious royal capital and no known royal inscriptions. If there was no central authority, the degree of coordination remains remarkable. Either way, the Indus system challenges simple categories. The settlements themselves vary widely. Some are large cities, some are medium-sized towns, and many are villages or specialised sites tied to craft, trade, farming, herding, or resource extraction. Dolavira, in the arid landscape of Kutch, shows a very different adaptation from Mohenjo-daro. Its stone architecture, city divisions, inscriptions, and large water reservoirs reflect a local response to water scarcity and seasonal runoff. Lothal, near the Gulf of Kambat, has often been discussed in relation to maritime trade, though the interpretation of its famous basin as a dockyard remains debated. Shortugai, far to the north in Afghanistan, appears connected to access routes for lapis lazuli and other materials. Coastal and inland sites show that the Indus world stretches across environments that demand different strategies. The civilization is unified, but not uniform in a lifeless way. It adapts. The hidden network is also a network of materials. Carnelian may come from regions such as Gujarat. Shell is worked near coastal zones and moves inland. Copper comes from several possible sources, including regions beyond the heartland. Lapis lazuli links the Indus world to highland routes reaching Afghanistan. Timber, stone, metals, semi-precious materials, cotton textiles, grain, animals, and finished craft goods all move through systems that are only partly visible today. A bead found far from its source is a tiny record of distance. A seal impression is a trace of trust or control. A weight is evidence that value has been measured. These small things show that the Indus world is not simply a group of farmers living beside rivers. It is a civilization of movement. Trade does not always require kings, but trade at this scale requires rules. It requires recognition of marks, confidence in measures, knowledge of routes, and some way to resolve conflict. Merchants or administrators must know who owns what has been delivered, what has been stored, and what has been promised. The Indus seals may have played a role in this world, perhaps marking ownership, identity, office, shipment, or status. Their exact function remains uncertain, partly because the script cannot yet be read, and partly because seals can serve more than one purpose. In Mesopotamia, seals are deeply tied to administration, identity, and authority. The Indus seals may have done similar work, but their imagery and context belong to a different tradition. The connection with Mesopotamia adds another layer. Mesopotamian texts refer to a place called Meluha, which many scholars identify with the Indus region or a zone connected to it. Goods associated with the Indus world, including carnelian beads, shell objects, ivory, woods, and perhaps textiles, appear in Mesopotamian contexts. There are references to Meluhan ships, Meluhan people, and even interpreters, suggesting real contact across the Arabian Sea and Persian Gulf. Yet the Indus civilization itself remains far quieter about Mesopotamia than Mesopotamia is about foreign lands. Once again, the asymmetry is striking. One side writes names into clay, the other leaves seals, goods, and unread signs. Harappa's role in this network is not just commercial, it also shows how deeply the Indus system is embedded in daily and regional life. Cemeteries at Harappa provide glimpses of individuals who lived and died in this world. Their burials are generally not extravagant compared with royal tombs elsewhere, but they include pottery, ornaments, and bodily evidence that can reveal health, diet, ancestry, and stress. Bioarchaeological research has suggested variation in health and social experience, reminding modern observers that the clean lines of city planning should not erase the human body. People suffer disease, injury, labour strain, and inequality. Civilization is not only what people build, it is also what people endure while keeping it built. One lesser known but important point is that many Indus settlements were not frozen copies of a master plan. They changed over time, and their participation in the wider system could intensify or weaken. Local traditions persisted beneath the mature Indus layer. Regional differences mattered. Some areas emphasized certain crafts, some adapted more strongly to water storage, some remained more rural. This matters because it makes the Indus world feel less like a rigid machine and more like a living civilization. Its coherence is real, but it is carried by many communities, not by one visible throne. That returns the story to the missing king. If Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Dholavira, Lothal, and many smaller sites all share signs of coordination, then power must have existed somewhere in the network, but perhaps it was not concentrated in one spectacular figure. It may have moved through institutions that left subtle traces, councils controlling trade, ritual groups preserving shared symbols, merchant families maintaining standards, city authorities managing infrastructure, or regional elites whose influence was expressed through access and administration rather than monuments. Scholars still debate these possibilities because archaeology can reveal patterns more easily than it can reveal intentions. Harappa widens the mystery because it proves the Indus achievement was not an isolated experiment. Across a vast region, people created a recognizable world without leaving behind the expected drama of kingship. Their unity appears in bricks, seals, weights, beads, pottery, streets, wells, drains, and routes. Their differences appear in local landscapes, materials, architecture, and settlement histories. Between unity and variation, the civilization holds together for centuries. And the more extensive the network becomes, the more urgent the question grows. How can so much order exist when the usual symbols of command remain almost invisible? The missing king problem begins as an archaeological puzzle, but it becomes something larger the longer it is considered. In many ancient civilizations, power leaves behind a loud signature. It builds upward, enlarges the human figure, buries wealth beneath monuments, records victories, lists titles, names dynasties, and turns authority into spectacle. Egypt has pharaohs carved into stone and buried beneath monumental architecture. Mesopotamia has rulers whose names survive on tablets, statues, foundation inscriptions, and royal boasts. Later South Asian kingdoms will leave inscriptions, coins, temples, palaces, and genealogies. But in the mature Indus world, at least with the evidence currently available, no ruler steps forward in the same unmistakable way. The cities are organised, but no king announces that he organised them. The system is disciplined, but no royal voice claims the discipline. This absence is not a small detail. It changes the way the entire civilization must be understood. Archaeologists can identify streets, wells, drains, weights, seals, craft production, settlement hierarchies, and long-distance trade. They can map neighbourhoods, compare brick sizes, study burials, analyse ceramics, examine bones, trace raw materials, and reconstruct environmental change. But when they ask who made final decisions, who controlled labour, who settled disputes, who owned surplus, who organised construction, who directed exchange, or who carried sacred authority, the evidence becomes harder to read. it is not because the Indus people lacked complexity. It is because their complexity does not translate easily into the royal grammar familiar from other early states. Early excavators sometimes looked for the expected signs anyway. They searched for palaces, temples, fortifications, and administrative buildings, because those were the categories that made sense from Egypt and Mesopotamia. Large structures were sometimes given names that implied functions before those functions were secure. A raised mound became a citadel, a large building became a granary, a substantial hall became an assembly space, the Great Bath became a ritual centre. Some of these interpretations may contain truth, but scholars still debate many of them. The problem is not that the structures are unimportant. The problem is that importance does not always reveal function. A large brick building can store goods, host gatherings, serve ritual purposes, house officials, or change use over time. Without readable inscriptions, certainty remains limited. The absence of royal tombs is equally striking. In Egypt, elite burial is central to understanding power. In Mesopotamia, royal graves at places such as Ur show extraordinary concentrations of wealth and status. In the Indus world, cemeteries are comparatively restrained. Burials may include pottery, ornaments, shell bangles, beads, copper objects, or personal items, but there is no known tomb that clearly proclaims a supreme ruler surrounded by extravagant treasure and sacrificed attendants. This does not mean Indus society was equal. Differences in burial treatment, health, diet, access to goods, and house size suggest social variation, but social difference does not appear in the form of spectacular royal death. The Indus elite, if that is the right word, did not make the grave into a political theatre on the same scale as some neighbours. The iconography deepens the puzzle. Indus seals and objects show animals, signs, composite figures, possible ritual scenes, and occasional human or human-like figures. One famous seal shows a horned figure seated in a posture sometimes compared to later yogic positions, surrounded by animals. Older interpretations linked it to a proto-Shiva or lord of beasts, but such identifications remain debated and should be treated cautiously. The image may represent a deity, a ritual specialist. A mythic figure, or something else entirely? What it does not obviously show is a named king. There are no repeated scenes of one human figure towering over captives, receiving tribute, smiting enemies, or standing before gods with royal labels. If Indus rulers existed, they avoided or did not require the visual language of domination common elsewhere. This restraint may have been cultural rather than accidental. The Indus civilization seems to have favoured small, portable, standardised objects over massive public declarations. Seals fit in the hand, weights fit on a balance, beads fit on the body, tablets, tokens, pottery marks, and sealings move through daily transactions. Even the script, where it appears, is usually brief. Instead of long royal inscriptions, the surviving signs come in short sequences. Often too short to reveal grammar clearly. The civilization may have placed authority in systems of identification and control that were practical, repeated, and widely recognised, rather than in monumental self-advertisement. What survives in the record suggests that power may have been embedded in procedures more than in personalities. Yet this creates a danger for modern interpretation. It is easy to romanticise the Indus world as a peaceful, egalitarian civilization without rulers, armies, or oppression. The evidence does not allow such a simple picture. Weapons are not prominent in the same way as in some other ancient contexts, and clear images of warfare are rare, but that does not prove the absence of conflict. Human societies of this scale contain competition, coercion, inequality, and violence in some form. Fortified areas, walls, social differences, and later signs of stress remind us not to turn silence into innocence. No single explanation fully accounts for what is missing. The absence of royal propaganda may reflect a different political system, a different ideology, poor preservation, misidentified evidence, or a script still refusing to speak. Some scholars have suggested that Indus cities may have been governed by corporate or collective forms of authority. Instead of a single ruler, power may have rested in councils, assemblies, merchant groups, priestly lineages, kinship networks, or combinations of urban elites. Such models are attractive because they explain how standardized systems might exist without obvious kings. A council does not need a giant statue of one man. A merchant oligarchy may care more about weights, seals, and trade routes than royal monuments. A ritual authority may emphasize purification, symbols, and shared practices rather than conquest imagery. A civic administration may invest in drains and wells, because urban order itself is the source of legitimacy. Still, these remain interpretations built from material clues. The evidence remains incomplete. Another possibility is that rulers did exist but expressed power through forms archaeologists have not recognized. A palace in the Indus world may not look like a Mesopotamian palace. A royal residence may have been built of materials that did not survive, or it may have been embedded within urban blocks rather than isolated as a grand structure. Royal authority may have been represented by signs in the unread script rather than by statues. Elite symbols may have been subtle, carried on seals, textiles, wood, or perishable objects. Important ceremonies may have occurred in spaces that appear ordinary when stripped of their furnishings. Archaeology often depends on survival, and survival is uneven. Fired brick survives. Wood decays, cloth disappears, painted surfaces fade. Power may have worn materials that time has taken away. Even so, the scale of the absence remains difficult to ignore. Across the Great Indus region, after more than a century of archaeological work, no universally accepted palace, royal tomb, dynastic inscription, or kingly monument has emerged. This does not prove that kings never existed, but it does mean kingship was not advertised in the familiar Bronze Age manner. The Indus civilization forces a distinction between political complexity and royal display. It shows that a society can organise cities, coordinate standards, and sustain far-reaching networks without leaving behind the kind of ruler-centred evidence that dominates other ancient histories. This is why the missing king is not merely a missing person, it is a missing category. Modern observers keep reaching for monarchy because monarchy is visible elsewhere, but the Indus world may have organised authority around something less personal and more institutional. Its great achievement may not have been obedience to a throne, but participation in a shared order. The brickmaker, the seal carver, the bead maker, the trader, the well digger, the drain cleaner, the farmer, and the household all operate within systems that outlast individuals. Authority is present, but it is diffused through standards. It does not need to carve a face 30 feet high if everyone already knows the measure of a brick. And yet the mystery remains open. A future discovery could change the picture. A bilingual inscription could unlock names. A newly excavated building could reveal political functions. A better understanding of signs might identify titles or institutions. The lost king may stay lost because he never existed in the expected form, or because modern eyes cannot yet recognise him. For now, the Indus cities stand as evidence of a different possibility. A Bronze Age civilization whose order is visible everywhere, while its rulers, if rulers there were, remain hidden behind the quiet authority of the city itself. If the Indus world does not reveal power through a king's face, then power has to be searched for in less obvious places. It may be found in the standard weight resting in a trader's hand, in the brick mould used by a worker who never sees the whole city plan, in the authority behind a seal impression, in the control of wells and storage, in the ability to organise repairs after floods, or in the quiet pressure that makes thousands of people accept the same forms across a vast region. Power without faces is harder to imagine because it does not produce the kind of dramatic image history often prefers. Yet it may be closer to how many people actually experienced authority in daily life, not as a distant ruler on a throne, but as rules, obligations, permissions, rituals, measures, and inherited customs that shaped what could be done. In the Indus cities, authority may have lived at the scale of the neighbourhood. A street drain, for example, is not just a technical feature. It is a social agreement made of brick. Every household that sends water into it depends on others not to block it, damage it, or neglect it. A covered drain requires access for cleaning. If waste builds up, the problem spreads beyond one house. Someone must decide when repair is needed. Someone must have the right to enter, lift covers, clear sediment, replace bricks, and perhaps demand labour or materials. The evidence remains incomplete, but the existence of such systems suggests a form of civic responsibility. Whether managed by appointed officials, neighbourhood elders, household groups, or specialised workers, the drain becomes a trace of authority in action. The same is true of wells. Water access shapes power in any city, especially in a hot and flood-prone environment where clean water is essential. Some houses at Mohenjo-daro appear to have private or semi-private wells, while others may have depended on shared sources. This difference may reflect wealth, status, household size, or neighbourhood organisation. A well is more than a hole in the ground. It requires construction, maintenance, protection from contamination, and social rules around use. In times of stress, the control of water can become the control of life. The Indus investment in wells and drainage may therefore reveal a society where authority was tied closely to managing the necessities of urban living, not merely to displaying sacred or military power. Craft production offers another possible location of hidden authority. The making of Indus goods often required specialised knowledge and access to materials from far away. Carnelian beads, shell bangles, copper tools, faience ornaments, steatite seals, and standardised weights did not appear from casual household activity alone. They required skilled labour, training, tools, workshops, fuel, supply routes, and systems of distribution. A beadmaker might depend on traders for raw stone. A seal carver might serve merchants, administrators, or elite families. A metal worker might need copper from distant sources. Whoever controlled access to materials and finished goods could gain influence without needing to build a palace. Power may have moved through workshops and storehouses as much as through ceremonial spaces. Merchants, in particular, are often considered when scholars imagine Indus authority. This does not mean the civilization was ruled by merchants in any simple way. That would be too neat, and no single explanation fully accounts for the evidence. But trade is central enough that commercial or administrative groups likely held significant power. Standardized weights, seals, long-distance contacts, and repeated symbols all fit a world in which goods must be identified, measured, guaranteed, and moved. If a merchant community can maintain trust across cities, it can become politically important. If certain families or institutions control exchange with coastal routes, highland materials, or Mesopotamian partners, their influence may be enormous while leaving behind very little that looks royal. Ritual authority may have mattered just as much. The great bath at Mohenjo-daro, the possible fire altars at sites such as Kalibangan, repeated animal motifs, figurines, special objects, and carefully arranged spaces suggest that belief and ceremony were woven into Indus life, even if their meanings remain uncertain. A society does not need pyramids to have sacred power. Ritual can happen in courtyards, bathing platforms, small rooms, open spaces, wells, thresholds, or seasonal gatherings. It can be carried on the body through ornaments, on seals through symbols, or in repeated acts of purification. If certain people controlled ritual knowledge, calendars, ceremonies, or sacred symbols, they may have guided society in ways archaeologists can only glimpse indirectly. There is also the possibility of corporate rule, a form of authority held by groups rather than one supreme person. In such a system, power may belong to councils of elders, leaders of important lineages, representatives of neighbourhoods, guild-like craft groups, ritual specialists, or merchant houses. Decisions may be negotiated rather than simply commanded. Public works may be organised through obligation, tradition, and shared interest. This kind of authority can be strong, even severe. Without producing the dramatic art of kingship, it may prefer symbols of group identity over portraits of individuals. It may emphasise continuity, purity, balance, and conformity. Scholars still debate whether this model fits the Indus evidence, but it helps explain how a civilization can be highly organised while keeping personal rulers almost invisible. The layout of Indus cities may support this idea in subtle ways. The absence of an obvious central palace does not mean the absence of elite residences, but it may suggest that no single household dominated the city architecturally. Larger houses exist, and some neighbourhoods may have been wealthier or more important than others. Yet the built environment does not revolve around one unmistakable royal compound. Public or semi-public structures appear, but their functions are often uncertain. Some buildings may have served administrative, ritual, storage, or assembly purposes. The ambiguity itself is important. It suggests that power may have been distributed through multiple institutions rather than concentrated in one towering seat. Still, power without faces can be difficult to prove because archaeology often sees the result more clearly than the mechanism. A straight street is visible, the meeting that approved it is not. A standardized weight survives, the authority that defined the standard does not. A sealed bundle may leave an impression, the argument over ownership disappears. A large platform remains, the ceremony or administration conducted on it vanishes. What survives in the record suggests organised behaviour across time and distance. But the human arrangements behind that behaviour remain partly hidden. The Indus mystery is therefore not whether power existed. It is what form power took when it did not need to name itself in stone. One surprising possibility is that the Indus ideology may have discouraged over individual glorification. In some cultures, rulers make themselves sacred by becoming visually larger than everyone else. In the Indus world, status may have been expressed through controlled access to objects, rituals, knowledge, or purity, rather than through portraits and conquest scenes. Small seals may have carried more authority than large statues. A sign sequence may have mattered more than a human face. A repeated animal symbol may have identified a group, office, clan, deity, or institution. If so, the civilization's restraint was not weakness. It was a different political language. This does not mean the Indus world was peaceful in an idealized sense. A society can avoid royal propaganda and still contain coercion. Labour may have been demanded, standards may have been enforced, social rank may have limited opportunity. Certain groups may have controlled goods, land, water, or ritual access. Some people likely worked harder and lived shorter lives than others. The archaeological record of bones, burials, disease, and urban stress complicates any romantic picture. The missing king should not become a myth of perfect equality. It should instead make the search more careful. As the Indus cities continue to grow, the faceless nature of power becomes both their strength and their riddle. A king can unify a state through command, but a system of shared standards can unify behaviour even more quietly. It can make distant people build alike, measure alike, seal alike, and recognise the same symbols without needing to see the same ruler. Such a system may be resilient because it is not dependent on one dynasty. It may also be fragile because when shared trust weakens, there is no obvious royal centre to restore it. The same invisible authority that holds the civilization together may leave few tools for modern observers to understand how it responds under pressure. For now, the Indus world remains a civilization of hands more than faces, hands shaping bricks, drilling beads, drawing water, pressing seals, clearing drains, weighing goods, lifting jars, repairing walls, and carrying traditions from one generation to the next. Somewhere behind those hands are institutions, obligations, leaders, and beliefs. They are real, but they are blurred. To approach them more closely, the story has to turn toward the smallest and most stubborn witnesses, the civilization left behind the seals and signs, the animals and marks, the script that seems to speak from every excavation report and yet still refuses to be read. The seals are small enough to fit in the palm, and that is part of their power. They do not tower over streets like monuments. They do not announce themselves from cliffs or temple walls. They are intimate objects, handled, carried, pressed, stored, lost, buried, and recovered thousands of years later from the dust of houses, workshops, drains, and debris. Many are made from steatite, a soft stone that can be carved and then fired until it becomes harder and often takes on a pale surface. On one side, a creature stands with disciplined stillness, a humped bull, an elephant, a rhinoceros, a tiger, a water buffalo, a goat, a composite animal, or the famous one-horned figure often called the Indus unicorn. Above or beside it runs a short row of signs. To the Indus people, these objects likely carried meanings that were immediate and practical. To the modern world, they are among the most beautiful locked doors in archaeology. The Indus script is one of the great unsolved problems of ancient history, not because no one has tried to read it, but because the evidence resists the kind of breakthrough that unlocked other ancient writings. Egyptian hieroglyphs had the Rosetta Stone, Mesopotamian cuneiform survived in vast numbers of tablets, many with long texts and repeated royal, legal, commercial, and literary formulas. The Indus signs survive mostly in short inscriptions, often only a few characters long. They appear on seals, seal impressions, pottery, copper tablets, stoneware bangles, tools, and small objects. The total number of known inscriptions is large enough to prove a repeated system, but the individual texts are usually frustratingly brief. They may contain names, titles, commodities, places, ritual formulas, or institutional marks, yet without longer texts or a bilingual inscription, every interpretation remains uncertain. This uncertainty has not prevented theories from multiplying. Many scholars believe the signs represent a writing system linked to a spoken language, perhaps Dravidian, early Indo-Aryan, Munda, or another language family, though no proposal has achieved general acceptance. Others have argued that the signs may not represent full writing in the same way as Egyptian or Mesopotamian systems, but instead function as symbols of identity, ritual, or administration. That view remains disputed, and many researchers continue to treat the script as genuine writing. The evidence remains incomplete, and the debate is sharpened by the shortness of the inscriptions. A system can look patterned without being fully understood. A script can be real and still remain unread. The Indus signs sit in that difficult space between order and silence. The direction of writing is itself a clue. Many inscriptions appear to have been written from right to left, based on sign crowding and layout, though there may have been variation. Certain signs occur more often at beginnings or endings, suggesting rules of order. Some signs repeat, combine, or appear in patterned sequences. Statistical studies have found structure that many interpret as linguistic or at least strongly rule-bound. But structure alone does not give meaning. A modern person can recognize that a code has grammar without knowing what any word says. The Indus script is not random. It behaves as if it belongs to a system. The torment is that the system still lacks a voice. The animals on the seals deepen the mystery because they are both familiar and strange. Some are real animals of the region or its wider ecological imagination. Powerful bulls with heavy humps, elephants, rhinoceroses, tigers, water buffalo, goats, and antelopes. These creatures may have represented clans, offices, deities, professions, places, or symbolic qualities. The one-horned unicorn-like figure is especially common, but its meaning is unknown. It might be a stylized animal shown in profile, a mythical creature, a ritual emblem, or a sign of some group identity. It often stands before an object that has been interpreted in many ways. Perhaps a ritual stand, incense burner, manger, filter, or offering device. No single explanation fully accounts for the repetition. Whatever it meant, it mattered enough to be carved again and again across the Indus world. A seal is not only an image, it is a tool. In many ancient societies, seals are used to mark ownership, secure containers, authorize transactions, identify individuals, and control movement of goods. A lump of wet clay pressed over a cord, jar stopper, door fastening, or package can preserve the impression of a seal. If the seal is broken, someone knows the container was opened. This turns a tiny carved object into a device of trust. The Indus seals may have served similar purposes. Though their exact contexts vary and scholars still debate the full range of uses. They may have identified merchants, households, officials, institutions, or ritual authorities. They may have moved with goods through markets and routes. They may have recorded relationships that were obvious to Indus people and invisible to everyone else. The seals also suggest a world of identity without portraits. In Egypt, a king's image can dominate a surface. In Mesopotamia, human figures and gods appear in narrative scenes. Indus seals more often present an animal and signs, not a named human ruler in triumphant posture. This does not mean humans are absent from Indus art. Figurines, masks or mask-like objects, small sculptures, and occasional seal scenes show human or human-like forms. But the main administrative or symbolic objects seem to favour animals, signs, and compact compositions. The civilization's language of authority may have been deliberately non-portrait based. A person's power may have been represented by a sign sequence and emblem, not by a face. This becomes especially important when thinking about the missing king. If an Indus seal contains the name or title of a ruler, modern observers cannot yet recognize it. A repeated sign might mean king, city, temple, grain, clan, god, merchant, or nothing close to any of those. A rare sign might be a personal name, a common ending might be a title, a fish-like sign might represent a sound, an object, an idea, a deity, or a rebus pun, depending on the system. Without a secure reading, every confident claim becomes dangerous. What survives in the record suggests a literate or symbolically literate society, but not one that explains itself in a language currently accessible. There are also Indus objects that seem to play with writing in different ways. Some pottery bears marks before or after firing, perhaps indicating ownership, workshop, contents, capacity, or ritual use. Copper tablets and small inscribed objects may have had administrative or ceremonial roles. Ceilings from some sites suggest goods or containers were marked. At Dolavira, large signs were found that may once have been mounted in a prominent display, perhaps near a gateway. Though their meaning remains unknown, this is a striking exception to the usual small scale of Indus inscriptions. It suggests that writing or sign display could sometimes be public and monumental in its own way, even if not carved into long royal proclamations. The silence of the script is painful because it blocks the most human details. The ruins can show that people bathed, traded, built, measured, drilled beads, and lived in houses. Bones can show diet, disease, stress, ancestry, and injury. Materials can show roots, but writing, if read, could reveal names. It could reveal whether a seal belonged to a person, a family, an office, a god, a city, or a merchant house. It could reveal whether the Indus world had titles for rulers, priests, scribes, traders, or officials. It could reveal whether the unicorn was an animal, emblem, or divine sign. It could transform the civilization from a pattern into a society of named institutions. Until then, the Indus people remained strangely close and distant at the same time. The seals therefore carry two kinds of evidence. They prove complexity, because they are standardized, widespread, skillfully made, and tied to systems of meaning, but they also preserve mystery, because their meaning is locked. They show that the Indus world possessed symbols powerful enough to travel across cities and generations. They show that identity and control mattered. They show that animals and signs formed a shared visual language. Yet they refuse to say whether the hand that pressed them belonged to a trader, official, priest, landowner, craft master, or servant acting on behalf of someone else. In this way, the Indus script becomes a perfect symbol of the civilization itself. It is orderly but unread, widespread but elusive, disciplined but quiet. It promises explanation and then withholds it. A seal found in the dust can feel like a message sent across 4,000 years, but the message arrives without its key. The animal still stands. The signs still march in a line. The carved surface still holds the pressure of an ancient hand. Around that hand once moved goods, voices, agreements, rituals, and names. To follow those movements, the story has to leave the seal in the palm and travel outward along the routes of craft and trade, where Indus objects crossed rivers, deserts, coasts, and seas. The Indus world is built not only from rivers and bricks, but from movement. A bead begins as stone in one region, becomes an ornament in another, and ends its journey far from the hand that shaped it. A shell is gathered near the coast, cut and polished in a workshop, carried inland, worn on an arm, buried with a body, or broken and discarded in a city street. Copper moves through routes that connect hills, plains, and settlements, timber, grain, cotton, ivory, faience, pottery. And animals pass through systems of exchange that are now mostly invisible except for the objects they left behind. The civilization's hidden network is not an abstract idea. It is a chain of hands, paths, boats, pack animals, storerooms, markets, workshops, and seals. It is the practical life of distance. At the centre of this movement stand craftspeople whose skill can still be felt in the objects they made. The Indus bead makers were among the great specialists of the Bronze Age. Carnelian, a reddish-orange stone often associated with Gujarat and other regions, was shaped into beads of remarkable refinement. Some long carnelian beads required careful heating to deepen their colour, precise shaping, and drilling through hard stone were tools that demanded both patience and technical control. The finished objects were small, but they carried enormous labour. A long bead smooth enough to catch the light was not just decoration. It was time made visible. It may have marked status, identity, gift exchange, trade partnership, ritual belonging or personal beauty. The evidence remains incomplete, but the care invested in these ornaments suggests they mattered far beyond their size. Shellworking reveals another map of connection. Marine shells from coastal areas were turned into bangles, inlays, ornaments, and tools. Sites near the Arabian Sea supplied raw material, but finished shell objects moved inland to cities and towns far from the coast. A person wearing a shell bangle in an inland settlement carried the sea on the body. This is one of the quiet surprises of the Indus world. Distant landscapes are compressed into personal objects, mountain stone, desert minerals. River clay, coastal shell, and sea roots all meet in urban households. The city is not only where people live, it is where environments are gathered, transformed, and worn. Metalworking adds another layer, though the Indus civilization is not defined by bronze weaponry, in the way some other ancient cultures are often imagined. Copper and bronze tools, blades, vessels, mirrors, ornaments, and small objects appear, but massive displays of military metal are not central to the surviving record. Copper had to be mined or acquired from distant sources, including regions such as Rajasthan, Baluchistan, Oman, or other zones depending on the object and period. And scholars still debate the exact pathways of many materials. Metal moved through exchange systems that linked the Indus people to landscapes beyond the alluvial plains. Each tool carries a hidden geography. Each copper object implies miners, smelters, traders, and users separated by distance but joined by need. The craft world was not random. Workshops at Indus sites show evidence of organised production, bead-making debris, unfinished objects, kilns, furnaces, drill bits, stone flakes, shell waste, and specialised tools reveal spaces where skill was concentrated. Some crafts may have been household-based, while others likely involved more controlled or specialised settings. No single model explains all production across such a large civilization. Still, the pattern suggests that certain goods were made in quantities beyond local household use. Indus artisans were producing for exchange, for status, for ritual, and perhaps for administrative systems. Their work helped bind the civilization together because objects made in one place could be recognised and valued in another. Trade within the Indus region may have been more important than trade beyond it, but the distant connections are especially striking. Mesopotamian texts refer to Meluha, widely identified by many scholars with the Indus region, or a closely connected area. The identification is not without complications, but it remains one of the strongest links between written Mesopotamian records and the silent Indus world. Mesopotamian sources mention Meluhan ships, Meluhan goods, and people associated with that distant land. Materials linked to the Indus, such as carnelian beads, shell objects, ivory, and perhaps woods or textiles, appear in Mesopotamian contexts. In some records, there are even references to interpreters of the Meluhan language, a small but fascinating clue that people from the Indus world may have been present in Mesopotamian cities, speaking words now lost. The sea route would have been demanding but possible. Boats moving from the Indus coast or Gujarat could travel through the Arabian Sea and into the Persian Gulf, stopping along coastal points and islands where water, shelter, and exchange were available. The people who made these journeys were not wandering into the unknown in a romantic sense. They likely followed learned routes, seasonal winds, coastal knowledge, and networks of contacts. Maritime trade in the Bronze Age required practical intelligence reading water, weather, cargo, risk, and trust. A single shipment could represent many lives behind it, from farmers producing surplus to craftspeople making goods, from seal owners authorising movement to sailors carrying cargo beyond sight of land. Overland routes mattered as well. The Indus world connected with highland areas to the west and northwest, where materials such as lapis lazuli, metals, and stones could be obtained through complex exchange chains. The site of Shortagai in Afghanistan is especially important because it shows an Indus presence or strong Indus cultural connection far from the main river cities, near routes associated with lapis lazuli from Badakhshan. This does not mean Indus merchants controlled every source directly, but it shows how far their networks could reach. A blue stone from the mountains could pass through many hands before reaching a workshop or elite context. The object might seem still, but its history is motion. The existence of trade raises the question of control. Goods do not move safely through complex networks by goodwill alone. They require agreements, trusted partners, recognised marks, measures, and perhaps institutions capable of enforcing obligations. This is where seals and weights return to the story. A merchant or official could use a seal to identify goods. A standard weight could establish quantity. A repeated sign could mark a person, household, guild, office, or institution. The exact meaning remains uncertain, but the system itself suggests accountability. The Indus people built trust into objects. They made exchange visible through stone, clay, and mark. There is a lesser-known irony in this trade world. Mesopotamian kings and scribes wrote about distant lands, tribute, exotic goods, and commercial contacts, while the Indus people, who were clearly part of the same wider Bronze Age exchange system, left no readable account of their side. The relationship survives unevenly. Mesopotamia gives names and texts. The Indus gives objects and signs. This imbalance can distort the story, making the literate voice seem more active than the silent one. But silence is not absence. Indus goods travelled. Indus people likely travelled. Indus ships may have reached ports where foreign languages filled the air. Their civilization was not isolated behind its rivers. It was looking outward, even if it did not leave modern readers a diary of the journey. Trade also carried ideas, though this must be handled carefully. Similar objects, techniques, or motifs can travel without entire belief systems moving with them. The Indus world knew of its neighbours, and its neighbours knew of it, but it remained distinct. It did not simply become Mesopotamian. It did not adopt royal inscriptions in the Mesopotamian style. It did not fill its cities with ziggurats. It absorbed contact while preserving its own discipline. This independence is important. The Indus civilization was part of a connected Bronze Age world, but its identity was not diluted by that connection. Its mystery, including the absence of known kings, becomes even more striking because its people clearly interacted with societies where kingship was loudly displayed. Behind every trade object is a human consequence. Someone mines stone in heat or dust. Someone cuts shell until the hands ache. Someone drills beads with concentration that cannot break. Someone carries goods along routes where animals tire. Water runs low and agreements can fail. Someone counts, weighs, seals, and records in a system now lost. Someone wears the finished object without knowing that thousands of years later it will be used as evidence for a civilization whose words cannot be read. The polished bead becomes a survivor. The broken shell bangle becomes testimony. The seal impression becomes a ghost of commerce. The Indus world at its height is therefore not only a civilization of clean drains and planned streets. It is a civilization of exchange, skilled labour, and far horizons. Its order depends on the farmer and the sailor, the craftsperson and the trader, the person who measures grain and the person who carves signs. Power may be hidden in these movements more than in palaces. Whoever controls routes, standards, seals, and valued goods controls part of the civilization's pulse. Yet even trade does not explain everything. Objects can reveal connection, but they cannot fully reveal meaning. To understand what the Indus people believed about purity, animals, fire, water, bodies, and the unseen world, the story must turn from distant shores back into the ritual spaces that remain so suggestive and so uncertain. The Indus people leave behind no great temple whose god can be named with certainty, no long hymn carved into stone, no royal dedication explaining which deity protects which city, and no priestly text describing how the world began. Their ritual life is visible only in fragments, and fragments can be dangerous because they invite the imagination to complete what the evidence cannot. A tank of brick becomes a sacred bath, a row of fire pits becomes an altar, a clay figurine becomes a goddess, a horned figure becomes a lord of animals, a tree becomes a shrine. Some of these interpretations may be partly right, some may be too simple. Scholars still debate almost every major claim about Indus religion, because the civilization offers symbols without translations and sacred-looking spaces without names. This does not mean the Indus world lacked religion. No ancient urban civilization of this scale can be understood as purely practical. The repeated concern with water, the care given to certain animals, the possible ritual scenes on seals, the figurines, the special structures, the treatment of the dead, and the controlled use of fire all suggest that belief shaped daily life. But Indus religion, if that is the right word for such a distant and unreadable system, does not present itself through giant temples. Its traces are smaller, more distributed, and often woven into ordinary spaces. Sacred practice may have lived in courtyards, bathing rooms, thresholds, wells, rooftops, neighbourhood platforms, small shrines, and seasonal gatherings. It may have been public at times and intensely domestic at others. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-daro remains the strongest symbol of this uncertainty. Its careful construction suggests importance. The brickwork is precise. The tank is lined and sealed in a way that shows concern with holding water. Steps descend into it from opposite ends. Rooms surround it. The whole complex sits on the raised mound, in a part of the city that already feels set apart by elevation and substantial architecture. Many scholars interpret it as a place for ritual bathing, purification, initiation, communal ceremony, or elite religious activity. That interpretation is plausible, but not proven in every detail. The tank does not come with a written instruction. It does not preserve offerings in a form that can be clearly identified. It does not tell whether ordinary people entered it, whether only select groups used it, whether it marked seasonal rites, or whether it served a function that has no exact modern comparison. What makes the Great Bath so compelling is that it fits a broader pattern of water consciousness in Indus cities. Bathing areas appear in houses, wells are frequent, drainage receives unusual attention. Water is controlled, channeled, cleaned away, and made part of built life. It may have carried practical, social, and ritual meanings at once. In many cultures, washing is never only washing. It can mark purity, transition, preparation, healing, status, or belonging in the Indus world. The evidence suggests water mattered deeply, but no single explanation fully accounts for the scale of that concern. It may have been both practical and sacred, both civic and personal. The same act of pouring water over the body could belong to hygiene, comfort, custom, and belief. Fire offers a different set of clues. At Kalibangan and some other sites, archaeologists have identified features sometimes described as fire altars or ritual hearths. These include rows or groups of prepared pits or platforms that may have been used in repeated burning activities. Interpretations vary, and some features may have had domestic, craft, or practical functions rather than strictly religious ones. Still, the careful arrangement of certain fire installations suggests controlled and meaningful use. Fire in the ancient world is never neutral. It cooks food, hardens pottery, fires bricks, transforms metal, burns offerings, protects against darkness, and destroys when uncontrolled. If the Indus people used fire ritually, it would not be surprising. The difficulty is knowing where practical fire ends and sacred fire begins. Clay figurines add another layer, but also another warning. Many small terracotta figures have been found, including female forms sometimes interpreted as mother goddesses or fertility figures. Earlier archaeology often leaned heavily on this explanation, seeing prehistoric and ancient female figurines across many cultures as evidence of goddess worship. Today, scholars are more cautious. A figurine can be a deity, a toy, an ancestor figure, a charm, a teaching object, a household ritual item, a votive offering, or something else entirely. The Indus female figurines may indeed relate to fertility, protection, domestic ritual, or divine power, but the evidence remains incomplete. It is safer to say they show that human bodies, adornment, and perhaps household belief mattered, rather than claim they reveal a fully known goddess cult. Animals are perhaps the most persistent sacred-looking presence in Indus imagery. Bulls, elephants, rhinoceroses, tigers, water buffalo, goats, and composite creatures appear with striking care. The one-horned unicorn-like animal dominates many seals. Some animals may have represented economic power, ecological familiarity, clan identity, mythic beings, or divine associations. The humped bull, for instance, evokes strength, masculinity, agriculture, and wealth. But that does not mean every bull image has the same meaning. The tiger may suggest danger, wildness, power, or boundary spaces beyond the city. The elephant may carry associations with strength and intelligence. The rhinoceros and water buffalo may link to marshy landscapes and untamed force. Yet without readable texts, these remain careful inferences. The animals stand before the modern viewer with all their ancient certainty and none of their explanation. The horned, seated figure on the famous seal remains one of the most debated images. It shows a central figure, possibly wearing a horned headdress, seated in a composed posture, surrounded by animals. Some earlier interpretations connected it to later South Asian traditions and called it a proto-Shiva or Pashupati figure. This idea is popular, but it is disputed and cannot be treated as established fact. The image may reflect a deity, a shamanic or ritual specialist, a mythic being, an emblem of authority, or a scene whose meaning has no surviving equivalent. What survives in the record suggests a powerful symbolic association between human or superhuman presence and animals. But the bridge to later religion remains uncertain. Continuity may exist in some broad cultural patterns, yet direct identification across thousands of years risks making the past too convenient. Burial practices show another kind of ritual restraint. Indus cemeteries include extended burials, pottery offerings, ornaments, and variations in treatment, but they do not reveal massive royal tombs or extreme wealth concentration. Some bodies are carefully placed, some graves include personal items, some cemeteries show changes over time. There are also instances of secondary burial or unusual mortuary treatment in certain contexts, though interpretations differ by site. Death clearly mattered, but the Indus dead were not generally turned into monuments of dynastic power. Their graves suggest care and social meaning, yet not the dramatic afterlife politics of Egypt. This again fits the broader pattern significance without spectacle. Ritual may also have been tied to the household. In a city where many houses include bathing spaces, courtyards, storage rooms, and controlled access from streets, domestic life may have carried sacred routines. A household might maintain purity practices, small offerings, ancestral memories, protective objects, or seasonal rites. Women, elders, craft specialists, or household heads may have played roles that leave little archaeological signature. Religion in such a world would not be confined to official buildings. It would live in repeated gestures, washing before a meal, placing an object near a threshold, wearing a bead, marking a pot, tending a flame, honouring an animal symbol, or sealing goods under the protection of a sign. The absence of giant temples therefore does not make the Indus world less religious. It makes its religion harder to isolate from life. In Egypt, a temple wall can declare sacred order in stone. In the Indus world, sacred order may have been distributed through the city itself in water, fire, animals, seals, household spaces, and shared symbols. This kind of religion can be powerful precisely because it does not depend on one monumental centre. It becomes part of the discipline of daily life. It flows through infrastructure, craft, and identity. Yet uncertainty must remain at the centre. The Indus civilization did not leave a readable theology. It did not name its gods for modern ears. It did not explain whether the Great Bath was sacred, civic, elite, or all of these at once. It did not tell whether figurines were goddesses, toys, charms, or ancestors. It did not reveal whether animals on seals represented gods, clans, offices, or stories. Every interpretation is built from surviving objects, comparisons, patterns, and cautious imagination. The result is not emptiness, but a sacred landscape seen through fog. And in that fog, one theme keeps returning. The Indus people seem to have invested meaning in controlled water, controlled fire, controlled signs, controlled craft, controlled measurement, controlled urban space. Their ritual life may have mirrored their civic life, both emphasizing order in a landscape shaped by unpredictable rivers and seasonal uncertainty. If so, religion and administration were not separate worlds. They may have reinforced each other, giving authority to those who managed purity, flow, symbol, and exchange. That possibility leads naturally back to water, the element that shaped their cities more visibly than any throne, temple, or monument, and perhaps held the key to both their greatness and their vulnerability. Water is the most ordinary miracle in the Indus world, and the most dangerous. It enters the story as river, rain, flood, well, bath, drain, reservoir, silt, mud, and memory. It feeds crops and breaks walls. It makes city life possible and threatens to erase it. The Indus people do not live beside water in a passive way. They study it, channel it, store it, avoid it, invite it, and build against it. Their civilization grows in a landscape where rivers can shift, floods can rise, monsoons can strengthen or weaken, and dry lands can become livable only through careful planning. In this world, control over water is never simply technical. It is social, political, and perhaps sacred. A city that manages water manages survival. Mohenjo-daro makes this visible at the scale of daily life. The city's wells are among its most striking features, not because a well is dramatic, but because so many appear within the urban fabric. A visitor expecting palaces may overlook them at first. They are circular shafts of brick, often built with wedge-shaped bricks arranged in rings, descending into the ground and rising through time as the city level changes. Some wells are associated with houses, suggesting private or restricted access. Others seem to serve broader groups. Their distribution suggests a society that invests heavily in making water available close to where people live. That detail changes the rhythm of the city. People do not always need to walk long distances to a river or public fountain. Water is pulled upward from within the city itself. But convenience carries a hidden demand for coordination. Wells can collapse, become polluted, dry out, or require rebuilding as occupation layers rise. The brick rings must be maintained. The area around a well must be kept usable. If a well serves several households, people must negotiate access, timing, cleaning, and responsibility. If a well belongs to a larger house, it may mark privilege. If it is public, it may mark civic planning. The evidence remains incomplete. But the number and quality of wells suggest a civilization that understands water access as a basic feature of urban order. A well is not only a source, it is a promise that the city will continue tomorrow. The drains show the other side of that promise. Water brought into a city must leave it. Bathing water, rainwater, household wastewater, and perhaps waste from latrine-like facilities all need pathways. In many Indus cities, especially Mohenjo-daro, drains run from houses into street channels. Some drains are covered, and some are built in ways that allow access for cleaning. The design is practical and surprisingly mature. It suggests that urban life is imagined not as a cluster of private households, but as a connected system. What one house releases can affect the lane. What the lane carries can affect the street. What the street fails to drain can affect the neighbourhood. Water forces people to recognise that they live together. This is one of the most revealing aspects of Indus urbanism. A palace can be built by command, but drainage requires cooperation over time. It is less glamorous and more stubborn. It has to work in the ordinary days after the ceremony is over. It has to be maintained by people whose names will never be known. If the drain blocks, no royal inscription can make the water flow. Someone has to remove the cover, scrape out the silt, repair the brick, and keep the channel open. Scholars still debate the exact organisation behind this maintenance, but the infrastructure itself points towards sustained civic habits. Indus order is not only planned, it is repeated. At Dolavira, water management appears in a different and equally impressive form. The city stands in the arid landscape of Kutch, where rainfall is limited and seasonal runoff must be captured carefully. There, large reservoirs, channels, stone architecture, and water control features show adaptation to scarcity rather than to the abundance of a great river plain. Dolavira does not simply copy Mohenjo-daro, it translates Indus principles into another environment. Water is collected, stored, and framed by architecture. The city's layout suggests that managing seasonal water was central to its survival. This regional variation matters because it shows the civilization's flexibility. The Indus system is not one rigid model imposed everywhere. It is a shared habit of order applied to different landscapes. Flooding, however, remains a constant threat in many riverine settlements. At Mohenjo-daro, repeated rebuilding and thick occupation layers have often been discussed in relation to flooding and environmental change. The details are complex, and not every layer of rebuilding can be reduced to a single flood event. Cities change for many reasons: decay, renewal, rising street levels, social pressure, and new construction. Still, living near powerful rivers means accepting periodic damage. A flood can undermine walls, fill drains with silt, contaminate wells, ruin stored grain, scatter animals, and force people to rebuild on top of what was lost. In such a world, resilience is not a slogan, it is brickwork after disaster. The Indus people seem to have understood elevation, platform building, and rebuilding as part of urban life. Raised mounds, substantial walls, and repeated construction episodes may reflect attempts to manage water, define important areas, or protect against seasonal danger, but interpretations remain cautious. A high platform may be defensive, ceremonial, administrative, flood-resistant, or some combination of these. The evidence does not always separate practical engineering from social meaning. In an ancient city, the two often merge. A raised area can protect buildings from water and also make them symbolically important. A reservoir can store water and also become a place of ritual. A bathing tank can clean bodies and also mark sacred transition. Water refuses to stay in only one category. The relationship between water and cleanliness is especially striking. Many houses with bathing areas suggest that washing was not rare or reserved only for public ceremony. The built environment makes repeated washing convenient enough to be part of daily routine for at least many residents. That does not mean every person enjoyed equal comfort, and it does not mean the city was clean by modern standards. Ancient cities are always full of organic waste, animals, smoke, insects, and disease. But the Indus investment in bathing and drainage shows a concern with managing the body and the household in relation to water. What survives in the record suggests that cleanliness, purity, comfort, and social expectation may have overlapped. This concern may have deeper cultural meaning. Later South Asian traditions give great importance to bathing, water, rivers, and purification, though direct continuity from the Indus civilization must be treated with caution. Thousands of years separate the mature Indus world from later textual and religious traditions, and many cultural transformations occur in between. Still, it is difficult not to notice that the Indus cities visibly organise themselves around water in ways that seem more than merely utilitarian. Scholars still debate how much can be inferred, but the possibility remains that water held symbolic power as well as practical necessity. The Great Bath, household bathing areas, wells, drains, and reservoirs together create a civilization in which water is constantly controlled, approached, and released. Water also connects the Indus people to uncertainty. A civilization built near rivers depends on forces it cannot fully command. Monsoons shift, snowmelt varies, channels migrate, silt accumulates, floods arrive too high or not at all. A river that once nourished a settlement can move away, leaving fields dry and roots broken. Another can flood too often, making city life exhausting. The Gagahakra region is especially important here because many settlements are associated with channels whose ancient flow history remains debated. Some researchers emphasize river changes and declining monsoon strength as major factors in later transformation. Others stress regional variation, social adaptation, trade changes, and the slow reorganization of settlement. No single explanation fully accounts for the civilization's eventual weakening. But water is impossible to remove from the story. In the mature period, however, water is still part of strength. It allows crops to grow, animals to drink, cities to function, crafts to operate, and people to gather in dense settlements. It supports the visible order that makes the Indus world so distinctive, but the same element that strengthens the cities also exposes them. A drain built with care can be overwhelmed, a well can be fouled, a reservoir can fail, a river can shift beyond the reach of tradition. A monsoon can weaken over generations slowly enough that no one moment feels like collapse, yet deeply enough that old systems become harder to sustain. The first cracks in the Indus order may therefore appear not as flames on the horizon, but as water arriving differently than before. By following water through the civilization, the missing king problem changes shape again. Perhaps authority in the Indus world is hidden because its greatest task is not conquest, but management of flow, purity, storage, maintenance, and risk. The people who hold power may be those who keep the city working, who know when to repair, where to build, how to measure, when to store, and how to preserve order in a landscape that never stops moving. But even the most careful system has limits. Beneath the disciplined streets and cleanly built drains, pressures are beginning to gather environmental shifts, changing trade, social differences, regional strain, and the slow fading of the standards that once held the world together. The first cracks in the Indus order do not appear as a single catastrophe. There is no clear layer across the entire civilization showing one great fire, one invasion, one earthquake, one flood, or one day when every city falls silent. The old idea of a sudden violent destruction has largely given way to a more complex picture. The mature Indus world changes unevenly, region by region, settlement by settlement, over generations. Some places weaken while others continue. Some urban habits fade while local traditions persist. Some networks shrink while new patterns emerge. This is what makes the decline so difficult to narrate. Human beings prefer endings with a moment, a culprit, and a visible wound. The Indus civilization offers something stranger, a slow loosening of the systems that once made distant cities feel like parts of the same world. The order had always depended on balance. Rivers had to remain useful, even if dangerous. Trade routes had to remain active, even if risky. Cities had to be maintained, even as floods, silt, heat, crowding, and decay pressed against them. Farmers had to produce enough food. Craftspeople had to receive materials. Standards had to be trusted. Seals had to mean something. Weights had to be accepted. Shared symbols had to keep their force across distances too large for face-to-face familiarity. For centuries, the Indus world managed this balance with remarkable success. But no ancient system is permanent. When several pressures begin to move at once, even a civilization built on discipline can start to lose coherence. Environmental change is one of the most important pressures, though it should not be turned into a single simple explanation. The climate of the wider region appears to have shifted over time, with evidence suggesting changes in monsoon patterns during the later 3rd and early 2nd millennium BCE. Some research points toward a weakening of the summer monsoon, which would have affected rainfall, river behaviour, agriculture, and settlement choices in different ways across the Indus domain. But climate does not strike all places equally. A city near a major perennial river faces different problems from a settlement dependent on seasonal streams or local rainfall. A region with access to groundwater may adapt differently from an arid zone. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the exact timing, scale, and consequences of climatic shifts. What can be said is that changing water systems made old urban arrangements harder to sustain in some areas. The Gagahakra region sits at the centre of this debate. Many Indus settlements are found along or near dry riverbeds and seasonal channels associated with this system. Some earlier ideas imagined a mighty river supporting dense urban life before vanishing suddenly. More recent research offers a more complicated picture, with debates over whether major glacier-fed rivers had already shifted away before the mature Indus period, whether monsoon-fed channels remained active in certain periods, and how communities adapted to changing flows. No single explanation fully accounts for every settlement pattern. Still, the broader point remains powerful. People had built lives around watercourses that were not fixed forever. When channels weakened, shifted, or became less dependable, the consequences could ripple through farming, trade, transport, and belief. Flooding may have been another pressure, especially in places like Mohenjo-daro. Too little water can damage a civilization, but too much water in the wrong form can do the same. Repeated floods can make city maintenance exhausting. They can fill streets with silt, damage drains, undermine walls, contaminate wells, and force rebuilding at higher levels. Archaeologists have long noted evidence of rebuilding and flood deposits at Mohenjo-daro, though the interpretation of these layers is complex. The city was not simply drowned once and abandoned, it endured, repaired, and continued, but repeated environmental stress can wear down confidence. A city can survive one flood, then another, while slowly becoming more difficult to maintain. Collapse is sometimes not a blow, it is fatigue. Trade networks also appear to change. The Indus world had been connected to Mesopotamia, the Persian Gulf, highland regions, and internal routes across South Asia. But long-distance exchange systems are sensitive. They depend on political conditions elsewhere, demand for goods, availability of transport, and the ability of merchants or institutions to maintain trust. In Mesopotamia, the late 3rd and early 2nd millennium BCE brought political shifts, changing trade patterns, and disruptions in Gulf exchange. The exact relationship between these changes and the Indus transformation remains debated, but the decline of certain external contacts may have reduced the flow of prestige goods, raw materials, or commercial opportunities. A civilization does not need foreign trade to exist, but if elite authority, craft specialization, or urban prosperity partly depends on exchange, then changing routes can weaken old centers. Inside the cities, social and economic pressures may also have grown. Large urban populations require food, fuel, water, craft materials, and constant repair. The surrounding countryside must support them. Fields must be productive, animals must be managed, timber and fuel must be gathered, often from landscapes already under pressure. Waste must be removed, disease must be endured, inequality must be controlled or justified. The archaeological record shows signs of variation in health and living conditions, especially in later phases at some sites. Though interpretations are cautious, urban life can generate stress even in successful civilizations. The more complex a city becomes, the more vulnerable it may be to disruptions in supply, labour, and trust. One of the clearest signs of change is the fading of standardization. In the mature Indus period, shared brick ratios, weights, seals, pottery traditions, and urban forms help define the civilization. In later phases, many of these become less consistent. Cities shrink or change character. Long-distance uniformity weakens. Certain types of seals become less common. Writing declines in use or visibility. Regional pottery styles become more pronounced. Settlement patterns shift towards smaller communities in some areas. This does not look like a people vanishing. It looks like a system losing its shared grammar. The bricks may still be made, but not always to the same rules. The symbols may survive, but not with the same reach. The civilization becomes less like one connected conversation and more like many local voices speaking at once. This kind of unravelling is easy to underestimate because it lacks drama, yet it may be more historically realistic than a single spectacular collapse. When a standard weight is no longer recognised everywhere, trade changes. When seals are no longer widely used, administration changes. When cities are no longer rebuilt with the same discipline, civic authority changes. When people move towards smaller settlements, social life changes. When water systems become less predictable. Farming strategies change. Each shift may seem manageable on its own. Together they alter the entire structure of the world. The Indus order may also have been vulnerable precisely because its power was so faceless. If authority was distributed through councils, merchants, ritual groups, neighbourhood systems, or shared conventions, it may have been flexible during normal times, but under stress, such systems can fragment. A king can sometimes force a response, though often brutally and not always successfully. A decentralized order may rely more heavily on trust and consensus. When environmental pressure, trade disruption, and regional difference increase, local communities may choose survival over uniformity. They may abandon distant standards not because they forget them, but because those standards no longer serve immediate needs. The missing king, once a sign of unusual political possibility, may become part of the mystery of decline. Still, it would be misleading to imagine despair everywhere. The people living through these changes may not have thought their civilization was ending. A family leaving a flood-damaged neighbourhood may have seen itself as moving to better land. A craftsperson adjusting to new materials may have thought of adaptation, not collapse. Farmers shifting crops or settlement locations may have been following opportunity. A town becoming smaller may still have been alive, noisy, and meaningful to its inhabitants. Civilizations are often named and bounded by later scholars, but the people inside them experience change as weather, work, marriage, hunger, birth, trade, and movement. The Indus world does not end in one emotional scene. It transforms through countless practical decisions. The evidence for violence remains limited compared with older invasion theories, but not absent from all discussion. Earlier interpretations, especially in the mid-20th century, sometimes link the end of the Indus cities to invading Indo-Aryan groups. That view is now widely rejected in its simple destructive form. The decline of urban Indus civilization predates or does not align neatly with such a dramatic invasion model. And archaeology does not show a civilization-wide layer of conquest. This does not mean there was no violence, migration, conflict, or social tension during the long period of transformation. It means the old story of cities destroyed by a single invading force does not fit the evidence. Scholars still debate the roles of migration, cultural change, and later, language shifts. But the collapse of mature urban Indus life is better understood as a gradual and regionally varied process. What makes this decline haunting is that the strongest evidence of the civilization's success becomes evidence of its weakening. The standardized weights that once reveal trust become rarer. The seals that once suggest identity and control lose their central role. The great cities that once held dense populations begin to shrink. The script, already unreadable to modern eyes, fades from the archaeological record. The shared visual world becomes less shared. It is as if the civilization's voice grows quieter even before it disappears from view. Beneath the order, then, the cracks are not only in walls, they are in connections. Rivers connect fields to cities, roads connect settlements, seals connect goods to owners or institutions. Weights connect strangers through measurement, symbols connect people through meaning. When those connections weaken, the civilization does not need to be destroyed from outside. It can become something else from within, and that is where the story now turns not to a night of flames, not to a battlefield, not to a murdered king whose tomb has never been found, but to the slow unravelling of urban life as the great Indus cities lose the force that once made them seem almost impossibly ordered. The unravelling of the Indus world is not the same as disappearance. This distinction matters, because the word collapse can make the past sound like a building falling in one motion, with dust rising and survivors staring at the ruins. The late Indus transformation is quieter and more uneven than that. In some places, the great cities shrink. In others, settlement continues in altered form. In some regions, people move away from old urban centres and towards smaller towns or villages. In others, local cultures become more visible as the broad mature Indus style loses its old authority. The civilization does not vanish like a torch blown out in darkness. It breaks apart like a river dividing into channels, each carrying something forward, while the old single current becomes harder to follow. At Mohenjo-daro, the old discipline weakens over time. The city that once seemed so carefully ordered shows signs of crowding, rebuilding, irregular construction, and changing use of space in later phases. Streets that had once been part of a coherent system become encroached upon or altered. Buildings are patched, modified, reused, and sometimes made with less attention to earlier standards. This does not mean the inhabitants suddenly become careless or incapable. More likely, the conditions that supported large-scale urban maintenance are changing. A city under stress often becomes more improvised. People repair what they can, occupy spaces differently, and make practical decisions in the shadow of fading institutions. The old grid is not forgotten all at once. It is negotiated, narrowed, interrupted, and slowly overwritten. Harappa also changes. Its long history continues through different phases, but the mature urban pattern loses force. Cemeteries and settlement layers show transitions in material culture, burial practices, pottery, and occupation. The site remains important for understanding continuity and change precisely because it does not simply stop existing. The people associated with later Harappan phases are not strangers arriving on a blank field. They live amid the remains and memories of an older urban system. Some practices continue, others change. Certain forms of pottery become more regional. The script and classic seals decline. The wide Indus uniformity fades, while local ways of life become more prominent. What survives in the record suggests not extinction, but reorganization. The decline of writing is one of the most haunting signs. During the mature period, seals and short inscriptions appear across the civilization's network. In the later period, their use diminishes sharply. This may reflect a decline in the administrative or commercial systems that required them. It may also reflect changes in identity, authority, or ritual. If seals once marked goods moving through long-distance exchange, reduced trade could make them less necessary. If signs once identified offices or institutions, the weakening of those institutions could silence the script. If writing was tied to elite practices, the transformation of elite power could reduce its visibility. Scholars still debate the exact reasons, but the fading of the script feels like the closing of a door before modern readers ever found the key. Weights, too, lose some of their old centrality. A standardized system of measurement only matters if enough people agree to honor it. When networks contract and local exchange becomes more important than long-distance integration, strict uniformity may become less useful. A village or regional market does not always need the same standards as a civilization-wide trade system. This does not mean people stop measuring. It means measurement becomes less tied to the old Indus order. A cube of stone that once helped strangers trust one another across distance becomes less central when exchange turns inward. The decline of standardization is therefore not a minor technical change. It marks a shift in the social world. Settlement patterns reveal another part of the story. In several regions, large urban centres decline while smaller settlements increase or persist. People appear to move toward areas where farming, herding, and local adaptation are more viable under changing conditions. In some zones, especially toward the eastern parts of the Indus sphere, later settlement patterns suggest a reorientation rather than abandonment. Communities adapt to monsoon-fed agriculture, changing river systems, and different local opportunities. This eastward and rural shift is often discussed as one of the major transformations after the mature urban phase. The old cities lose prominence, but life continues in dispersed forms. The civilization becomes harder to see archaeologically because it is no longer concentrated in huge brick-built centres. This shift may have changed social experience profoundly. Life in a large city like Mohenjo-daro depends on strangers. A person may not know who made the bead, who sealed the jar, who cleared the drain, who grew the grain, or who set the weight standard. Urban civilization creates a web of indirect dependence. Smaller settlements bring different relationships. People may know more of those around them. Authority may be more local. Production may be less specialised. Ritual may become more household or village-centred. Trade still exists, but its scale and texture change. For those living through the transition, this may not have felt like a fall into ruin. It may have felt like returning to more manageable worlds after the burdens of urban life. At the same time, the loss of cities means the loss of certain possibilities. Large-scale craft specialisation becomes harder to sustain without dense demand and organised exchange. Long-distance uniformity weakens. Public works become smaller. Urban memory fades. The great drains may still exist beneath abandoned streets, but they no longer serve a living crowd. Wells may silt up. Bricks may be taken from old walls and reused. Seals may become heirlooms, scrap, curiosities, or objects whose meanings change. Children born generations later may live near ancient mounds without knowing the full system that created them. The city becomes a source of material, not a living institution. There is no reason to imagine that everyone left willingly or comfortably. Environmental stress, declining trade, disease, resource pressure, social tension, and failing infrastructure could have made urban life increasingly difficult. Families may have faced hard choices, stay in a shrinking city with fading opportunities, or move towards smaller settlements where land, water, or kinship networks offered better survival. Some neighbourhoods may have emptied gradually. Others may have remained occupied long after the city's greatest days had passed. Some people may have clung to old places because memory itself is a form of wealth. An abandoned city is never abandoned all at once by the heart. The absence of a known king again shapes the story. In many historical collapses, the end is narrated through dynasties: the last ruler, the failed heir, the defeated army, the burned palace. The Indus world gives no such figure. There is no final king of Mohenjo-daro whose name marks the end. No last Harappan ruler sends a desperate inscription to the gods. No royal tomb seals the story. The civilization's decline is as faceless as its power. This makes it harder to tell, but perhaps more truthful. Most people in collapsing systems do not experience collapse as royal drama. They experience it as failing wells, uncertain harvests, broken roots, fewer goods, changing neighbours, and the slow realisation that old certainties no longer hold. The late Indus world is therefore not an epilogue of ruins, but a landscape of adaptation. People continue to farm, herd, make pottery, use ornaments, maintain local traditions, and carry memories forward. Some elements of Indus life may survive in transformed ways, though direct lines of continuity are often difficult to prove. Crops, craft habits, settlement knowledge, symbolic preferences, and water practices do not simply vanish. They move with people. They become local. They blend with new influences. They enter later cultural worlds not as a complete civilization, but as fragments carried in hands and habits. By around 1900 BCE, the mature urban phase has largely ended, but the human story has not. The grand coherence of the Indus system is gone or fading. The cities that once held thousands no longer dominate the landscape in the same way. The script retreats. The seals lose their central role. The old standards weaken. Yet across the plains, people remain. Their descendants, neighbours, or cultural successors continue to live in the wider region, responding to new climates, new migrations, new forms of exchange, and new social arrangements. The Indus civilization has not been swallowed by the sea or buried by a single disaster. It has dissolved into the living world around it. That may be the most unsettling kind of ending. A sudden catastrophe leaves ruins that point to a moment. A slow transformation leaves questions scattered everywhere. When did the city stop being itself? When did a seal become an old object rather than an active tool? When did a brick ratio cease to matter? When did the last person who understood the script press a sign into clay? The evidence cannot answer these questions with precision. It can only show the fading pattern. The civilization that once seemed held together by invisible rules now releases its people into smaller, more regional worlds. The old cities fall silent, but the people who made them continue, carrying the past not as a monument, but as memory, practice, and survival. After the cities fall silent, the Indus world does not disappear into emptiness. This is one of the most important corrections to the old imagination of vanished civilizations. The great urban system fades, but the people do not simply walk off the edge of history. They remain in villages, small towns, river plains, dry zones, foothills, and changing settlement landscapes. They continue to plant crops, herd animals, shape pots, make ornaments, build houses, bury their dead, and adapt to new conditions. The civilization as a unified urban tradition weakens, but human life goes on with the stubbornness that defines most of history. What ends is not a people. What ends is a particular way of organising people, materials, signs, water, and distance. This matters because the phrase Indus collapse can mislead. It can make the past sound like a world erased, when the archaeological record suggests transformation. After the mature urban phase, many communities continue in what archaeologists often call late Harappan cultures, though the term covers a range of regional developments rather than one simple successor state. Pottery styles change, settlement patterns shift, some craft traditions continue in altered forms. Farming and herding remain central, the use of the Indus script declines sharply, and the classic seals become rare, but daily technologies and local habits do not vanish overnight. People no longer participate in the same wide standardized system, yet they still inherit parts of it. Civilization breaks apart into lives. The movement towards smaller settlements may have been a rational response to changing conditions. If large cities become harder to maintain because of river shifts, floods, weakening monsoons, declining trade, or social strain, then dispersed communities can offer resilience. A smaller settlement needs less centralized infrastructure. It can adjust more quickly to local water, soil, pasture, and kinship networks. It may not produce long carnelian beads for distant markets or maintain elaborate covered drains, but it can survive. Survival is not always monumental. Sometimes it is the decision to live where crops are more reliable, where animals can graze, where relatives can help, where old urban obligations no longer weigh so heavily. The eastern shift in settlement is especially significant. As the mature Indus centres in parts of the west and lower Indus decline, populations and cultural activity appear to become more dispersed across regions, including parts of Haryana, Punjab, western Uttar Pradesh, and Rajasthan. The details vary and remain debated, but the broader pattern suggests that people adjusted to different river systems, rainfall regimes, and agricultural possibilities. Some communities relied more on monsoon-fed agriculture, others combined farming with pastoral mobility. The old urban heartlands did not dictate the future in the same way. The map of life changed, and with it the map of memory. Continuity is difficult to prove, but traces are suggestive. Certain pottery traditions evolve rather than disappear. Some ornaments and craft habits continue. Agricultural practices persist and diversify. Cattle remain important. Crops such as wheat and barley continue, while millets and rice become more significant in some later regional contexts. Though the timing and spread differ by area, the deep familiarity with water, seasonal rhythms, and local adaptation remains essential. What survives in the record suggests that the descendants or cultural successors of Indus communities helped shape later South Asian landscapes, even if the exact pathways are complex. The Indus civilization does not hand a complete written inheritance to the future, but it leaves habits embedded in land and life. The question of population and ancestry adds another layer. Modern genetic and archaeological research has made clear that South Asian prehistory involved deep local roots, movements, mixtures, and transformations over long periods. The people of the Indus world were part of this complex human background. Later populations in South Asia were shaped by multiple ancestral streams, including groups related to ancient Iranian agriculturalists, indigenous South Asian hunter-gatherer lineages, and later steppe-related ancestry in many regions, though the timing, scale, and cultural implications remain active areas of research. It would be too simple to equate genes directly with language, identity, or civilization. Still, the biological story reinforces the archaeological one. The Indus people were not replaced in one clean sweep. Their world became part of the deeper ancestry of the subcontinent. Language remains one of the most tantalizing uncertainties, because the Indus script is unread. No one can say securely what language or languages the civilization used. Some scholars have proposed Dravidian connections. Others have suggested different possibilities or multiple languages across the region. The evidence remains incomplete, and no theory has achieved final consensus. If later South Asian languages preserve echoes of Indus speech, those echoes are difficult to isolate with certainty. This silence is painful because language is where people name themselves, their gods, their places, their professions, their fears, and their kin. Without it, continuity must be traced through objects, settlement patterns, biology, crops, and customs rather than words. The later religious and cultural legacy is equally delicate. It is tempting to draw direct lines from Indus water practices to later South Asian ideas of purification, from the horned seal figure to Shiva, from female figurines to goddess worship, from animals on seals to later sacred animals. Some broad continuities may exist in themes, landscapes, symbols, or practices, but direct identification across such vast time is uncertain. Civilizations change, new peoples arrive, languages shift. Ritual systems transform, ideas are reinterpreted. A symbol can survive while its meaning changes completely. The responsible view is not to deny all continuity, but to resist turning resemblance into proof. The Indus legacy may be real and deep, but much of it is indirect, transformed, and absorbed into later worlds. The abandoned cities themselves became part of that later landscape. Ancient mounds rose above fields and plains, sometimes reused, robbed for brick, settled near, avoided, or forgotten as cities. Local people may have known them as old places without knowing their true age. Bricks from Harappa were famously reused in railway construction thousands of years later, long before the site was fully understood. That act feels brutal now. But it also reveals how ancient monuments can pass from memory into material. A brick once part of a city wall becomes ballast beneath a modern track. Past is not only studied, it is consumed, repurposed, and sometimes destroyed by later needs. When archaeology finally began to reveal the scale of the Indus civilization in the 20th century, it changed the history of South Asia and the ancient world. Harappa and Mohenjo-daro showed that urban civilization had flourished in the subcontinent alongside Egypt and Mesopotamia. This was not a marginal region waiting for later history to begin. It was one of the great centres of Bronze Age urbanism. Yet the discovery also introduced a different kind of grandeur. The Indus world did not fit neatly into the old image of ancient power. Its greatness lay not in named kings, but in streets, drainage, standardization, trade, water, craft, and an undeciphered script. It forced historians to widen the definition of civilization. For later generations, the Indus cities also became mirrors. Different people have looked at them and seen different desires of peaceful civilization, a lost urban ideal, a forgotten ancestor, a mystery of writing, a symbol of South Asian antiquity, a challenge to Western-centered histories of early civilization, or a warning about environmental fragility. Some of these interpretations are useful, and some become too eager. The evidence must remain the anchor. The Indus people were not symbols created for modern arguments. They were real communities living through heat, flood, labour, illness, beauty, skill, belief, and uncertainty. Their legacy deserves wonder, but also restraint. The most durable legacy may be the question they leave behind. How much of a civilization must survive for it to be remembered? Egypt leaves pyramids and names. Mesopotamia leaves tablets. The Indus leaves cities without known kings, signs without secure readings, an infrastructure that speaks more clearly than any ruler. Its afterlife is therefore fragmented, but not weak. It survives in archaeological method, in debates over writing and power, in the study of ancient climate, in the deep history of South Asia, and in the imagination of anyone who looks at a seal and feels the pressure of an unknown hand. After the cities fall silent, the story becomes less visible, but perhaps more human. People adapt. They leave old streets. They carry seeds, animals, tools, memories, and skills. A potter teaches a child a shape that has changed from older forms. A farmer plants in a new field because the old water is unreliable. A family wears ornaments whose meanings have shifted. A community remembers an old mound as a place of brick and dust. The grand urban system is gone. But life continues in smaller circles. This is not the ending of the Indus people. It is the dispersal of their world into the long, complicated future of South Asia, where the past survives not as a throne or a dynasty, but as 1,000 quiet continuities. The civilization that refused kings, or at least refused to show them clearly, leaves behind a final puzzle larger than any single ruin. The Indus world was too organised to be dismissed as a loose collection of villages, yet too quiet about political power to fit the familiar image of an ancient empire. It covered an enormous region. It built major cities. It standardised bricks, weights, seals, and forms of craft. It managed water with unusual care. It traded across long distances. It developed signs that remain undeciphered. It endured for centuries, and still, after all that, no known king steps forward from the dust. No ruler's name gathers the story around itself. No palace dominates the map beyond debate. No royal tomb turns death into spectacle. The centre of the civilization remains strangely unoccupied. This does not mean the Indus people had no leaders. That would be too simple, and the evidence does not support such a comfortable conclusion. Large cities need decisions. Trade networks need trust. Craft systems need organisation. Public works need labour. Standards need enforcement or deep social agreement. The Indus world must have contained people and institutions with authority, influence, and privilege. Some households were larger than others. Some individuals had access to rarer goods. Some groups may have controlled craft knowledge, water, exchange, ritual, land, or administration. Inequality almost certainly existed in some form, but the civilization's archaeology does not place one ruler above all others in the way Egypt or Mesopotamia often does. Power exists, but it wears no obvious crown. That may be the key to its uniqueness. The Indus civilization may have been built around shared systems rather than royal personalities. Its unity appears less like a command shouted from a throne, and more like a pattern learned by thousands of hands. A brickmaker follows a ratio, a trader trusts a weight, a seal carver repeats an animal and a short line of signs, a household builds a bathing platform, a neighbourhood maintains drainage, a city raises platforms, repairs streets, manages wells, and organises craft. A distant settlement recognises the same conventions. No single gesture explains it, but together they create a civilization. What survives in the record suggests that Indus authority may have been institutional, corporate, ritual, mercantile, civic, or some combination of these, rather than simply dynastic. Scholars still debate this because the clues remain stubbornly incomplete. The unread script is the greatest barrier. If it were deciphered, the missing king problem might change overnight. The signs could reveal rulers, titles, gods, cities, offices, lineages, merchants, taxes, or rituals. They could show that Indus kings existed but were represented in unfamiliar ways, or they could confirm that authority was organised around councils, clans, temples, trade houses, or administrative groups. At present, every model must be built from mute evidence buildings without labels, seals without translation, burials without royal names, and cities whose greatest achievements are practical rather than boastful. The civilization is not unknowable, but it is only partially readable. The absence of obvious kings also affects how the collapse is understood. There is no final dynasty to trace. No list of rulers grows weaker generation by generation. No inscription records famine, rebellion, invasion, or divine anger. The end of the mature Indus phase has to be reconstructed through settlement shifts, environmental data, changing material culture, fading standardization, declining seal use, and regional transformations. That evidence points away from a single dramatic fall and toward a slow unravelling. Rivers change, monsoons shift, trade patterns weaken, cities become harder to maintain, local communities adapt. The civilization loses the shared grammar that once made it so recognisable. The disappearance of the kingly voice at the beginning is matched by the absence of a kingly lament at the end. There is a kind of humility in this. The Indus world reminds modern observers that history is not only made by named rulers. Many of the most important forces in human life are collective and anonymous. Someone designs a drain, but the name is gone. Someone standardises weights, but the decree is lost or was never written in the way expected. Someone teaches the correct shape of a brick. Someone knows how to waterproof a tank. Someone drills stone with extraordinary patience. Someone keeps a route safe enough for goods to move. Someone presses a seal into clay and trusts that another person will understand. These are not small acts. They are the invisible machinery of civilization. The Indus achievement is therefore almost the opposite of a monument to ego. It is a monument to system. Its cities do not ask to be admired from a distance as mountains of royal ambition. They ask to be understood from within, through the movement of water, the privacy of houses, the width of streets, the logic of drains, the repetition of seals, and the careful measurements of stone weights. Their mystery is not that they were primitive, but that they were sophisticated in a way that does not flatter the usual stories. They show that early civilization could be orderly without being obviously imperial, urban without being loudly royal, expansive without leaving conquest scenes at its centre. Yet restraint should not become fantasy. The Indus world was not a peaceful dream outside history. Its people lived with labour, disease, hierarchy, environmental risk, and social pressure. Its cities required maintenance that may have been burdensome. Its standards may have been enforced by authorities whose methods are invisible. Its trade may have enriched some more than others. Its rituals may have excluded as well as united. The absence of royal propaganda is not proof of justice. It is proof only that this civilization expressed power differently, or that the evidence of its rulers has not survived in recognisable form. No single explanation fully accounts for this silence. That silence is why the Indus Valley remains so compelling. The ruins seem to answer practical questions with remarkable clarity and deeper questions with almost deliberate restraint. How did water leave the house through the drain? How were bricks made, often according to standard ratios? How were goods measured with carefully calibrated weights? How far did trade reach to distant coasts, highlands, and Mesopotamian contacts? But who ruled? What language did they speak? What did the signs say? What did the unicorn mean? What god, if any, watched over the Great Bath? What name did Mohenjo-daro carry when it was alive? Here the evidence grows quiet. Perhaps that is fitting. A civilization without a known king does not offer a single face to remember. It leaves a crowd instead, farmers on river plains, potters near kilns, beadmakers bent over hard stone, sailors watching the coast, women drawing water from wells, builders laying brick, children moving through courtyards, elders preserving rules no archaeologist can hear, traders pressing seals into clay, and unknown officials or ritual specialists maintaining an order that outlived them all. The Indus world is not empty because its rulers are hidden. It is full because so many unnamed lives still press against the remains. In the end, the missing king may be less a failure of discovery than an invitation to look differently. The Indus civilization asks for attention to what usually remains beneath grand narratives infrastructure: standardization, cooperation, water and craft, and the shared habits that make urban life possible. It asks historians not to confuse silence with simplicity. It asks whether power can be strongest when it does not need to carve its face into stone. And it asks how a world so disciplined could become so difficult to read once its script fell silent and its cities returned to dust. The ancient Indus people did not vanish overnight. Their cities changed, their networks weakened, their symbols faded, and their descendants or cultural successors moved into new forms of life. What disappeared was the great urban pattern that once made the civilization recognizable across a vast landscape. The king, if there was one, remains unknown. The script remains unread. The seals remain patient. The drains remain under ruined streets. Still testifying to a society that understood order with extraordinary care. Among the broken bricks and dry winds, the Indus world leaves its final message without words. Civilization does not always speak through rulers. Sometimes it speaks through the systems people build together, and through the silence they leave when those systems are gone. Now the ruins settle back into stillness. The streets of Mohenjo-daro no longer carry footsteps in the heat of morning. The wells no longer echo with jars lowered into darkness. The drains no longer receive the water of bathing rooms and courtyards. The seals no longer close bundles of goods or mark a promise between distant hands. The signs remain, but their voices are sealed inside them, as if the civilization has chosen to speak only in fragments. Across the plains, the rivers continue their slow work. They shift, dry, flood, return, and abandon old paths. Dust gathers over brick. Grass grows where walls once divided rooms. Later, people pass by the mounds, take bricks, build new lives, forget old names, and carry forward pieces of a past they may no longer recognize. Nothing human stays complete forever. Even the most carefully planned city depends on water, weather, memory, labour, and trust. When those things change, stone and brick remain for a while, but the living pattern slips away. The Indus civilization endures because it does not explain itself fully. It leaves enough to prove its greatness and withholds enough to keep that greatness mysterious. It gives the world cities without known kings, writing without a secure reading, ritual without named gods, order without a visible throne. Its silence is not emptiness, it is distance. It is the distance between a hand pressing a seal into wet clay and a modern eye trying to understand the mark. It's the distance between a city alive with voices and a mound under the sun. Yet there is comfort in the fact that the people themselves were not merely lost. They adapted, moved, planted, built, remembered, forgot, and became part of the long human story that followed. Their civilization changed form, as all civilizations eventually do. What remains is not a final answer, but a lingering image, a brick well descending into the earth, a small seal held in the palm, a line of unread signs above a silent animal, and beyond them the wide river plain. Glowing softly in the evening light, carrying away the names of kings no one has found, and the lives of countless people who built a world together,